But yeah, my name is DP. I am an Army combat veteran, disabled Army combat veteran, and also retired from federal law enforcement medically. So I've been through the gamut of a few of these things and been in the space for quite a number of years. So founder of VNCC, and I get the pleasure of serving alongside some of these amazing people who you will see here today. Um, there will be a recording of this. So again, like Naomi said, we'll have this recording out for you all. We will also have give the ability for everyone to have a quick uh, call with one of our advisors, just for context and kind of help to kind of give everybody a lay of the land. We have folks here who join from social media and are kind of trying out our kind of a la carte option. We also have veterans here with us who are working with us on the advisory side. So we have a mix of both, just to kind of put in perspective. So we see like some vets here who have a name after their name. That just means they're working, let's say, with one of the advisors here. So that's what that means. So just to kind of put in perspective, just, we're kind of merging two groups. And one of the biggest things for this, right, to kind of give perspective, we want to be able to offer options to veterans. So when we look at things like this, these are questions that we get a lot. And I look at it from the perspective of saying, before, let's say there's many organizations that you can reach out to and say, I want to work with, let's say, this organization or contract with that one. But sometimes, like buying a vehicle, you want to kick the tire. You want to take a test drive. You want to actually see what folks are about. So doing things like a workshop is now a supplementary option for folks that may want to say, well, maybe I don't want to sign up with this organization, or maybe I want to kind of just, pick and choose certain things. So giving folks options to kind of test things out and kind of try new things. So this is in response to some of the questions and demands that have been out there. But again, for perspective, that's what we see. That's what you'll see here, a combination of both, new folks and some folks have been around. So we're all kind of getting to know each other in that regard. So getting to the task at hand, we are talking Nexus letters. This is the agenda that we're going to be going through, and we're going to be using, and you'll see me kind of jump back and forth at times to the workbook as well, because that's what you're going to take, right? So we're going to obviously hit an introduction about the Nexus letters, what is a Nexus and things of that such. We're going to touch on the 4 elements of a Nexus letter. And this is key because when we start to look at either going to your provider to help you write one of these letters or what have you, or going through the process of paying a professional to do this, you want to make sure key things are in there. Because again, if you don't know what you don't know, you can get a letter that may be substandard and missing key elements. And what you don't want to do is pay someone, which there are services out there, to do a letter for you, only to have it come up short. Then we're going to talk about the VA standard of proof. We're going to talk about taking control of your claim, go into conclusion Q&A session. So we're going to cover a lot of topics. So really questions you may have, please understand there is no such thing as a dumb question. This is a brand new environment for many people. So the whole concept here is to make sure that we have a grasp and understanding on the process. So that's what is on the agenda for today. Everybody should have received their workbook as well, and we didn't let us know, but you'll know you have it because it looks a little something like this. And again, we'll be showcasing that, and I'll be kind of flipping back and forth as we proceed, just to kind of put it in perspective for everyone. So with that being said and done, let us move to this side of the house. So understanding what a nexus is, let's start with one question. In the chat, if you can put down if you know what a nexus is, yes. And if you do not know, put no, because that kind of obviously helps us gauge where we're at. So when we're talking nexus letters or independent medical opinions, fundamentally, do you know what they are? Yes or no? Because obviously you want to be able to kind of get a baseline on folks. If you do not know, again, please feel no shame to the fact that you don't know, because that's what this is about, is to make sure that we're all proceeding forward at the same time. So if there is anyone who does not know what that is, okay, check Armando. And that's the whole point. I want to make sure, so I don't want to breeze over something, to make sure that, we bring everybody to the same level. Yes, but I know okay, check, Ronnie, check. So when we start to look at, the things for a Nexus letter, right? We're going to hit on the overview of the importance of Nexus letters and disability claims. And the biggest thing here is, as you'll start to see, it's a connecting piece. So what a Nexus, the word Nexus means It's connection. It's what's connecting one to the other. Is the nexus required? The answer is no. However, the longer you've been out of service, the more difficult it becomes at times to connect certain things. So outside of presumptions, so let's say you have a presumptive condition, how do you make the argument that, let's say, that injury or thing you're dealing with is actually related to service, right? A lot of life has happened. You've been out 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. How do we connect these things? So that nexus is filling in the gap. So then we're going to touch on as well the Kaluza triangle, 3 elements necessary to demonstrate eligibility for VA disability, and why a private medical opinion nexus letter may be necessary to increase your claim and be successful in that process. So this is kind of the biggest thing that we're looking at here. But again, when we start to consider what a nexus is, it's literally, again, that connecting piece. And we'll see here also in the workbooks, again, I want to make sure that we're not only touching this, but even afterward, because again, sometimes some folks are better to be able to read things versus being able to hear something. This is what you'll see in the workbook that we're working towards together, right? So introducing the nexus letter concept, gathering evidence, preparing the nexus letter, mistakes to avoid, what to do after the letter is submitted, CMPs, things of that such. We're going to talk some conclusion, bonus resources, and sample letters and nexus letters that are in there. So just to kind of put that as far as what you all need to look at and see. So here we start, again, the same things we're breaking down, why it's important. This is something you can all print out. But one of the key things I want to look at, we got a few folks jumping in here, so I want to give it a second real quick. Check. So, and again, I'm using both of these just to make sure it makes sense as you're going back. But so we understand that the nexus letter is the connecting piece. Now, who can write a nexus letter? One of the questions that comes out a lot is, does it have to be the VA? Can it be my private provider? And the answer is, it could be any provider that's qualified to be able to write that letter. Now, there's some caveats here when we look at things like mental health. So, for example, a general practitioner can write a letter specific to your condition. But when it comes to mental health, that's one of the unique ones, because we want, that has to be something that comes from a psychologist or psychiatrist. And we'll begin to talk about the specific use cases for different nexus letters. But when we're looking at this right here, as you see on the workbook specifically, this is not only what it is, but who actually has to write it, which has to be part of the equation here. Now, why is it important? Obviously, is because when it's all said and done, we start to look at the Kaluza triangle, and I'll switch over. You also see it here on the next page. It's also understanding how we're making that argument. So who has never seen or heard of this concept, the Kaluza triangle? So I'll give it a second to make sure that we get some answers there. Most folks have seen it if you've been to orientation class and so forth. But if you have not, do let me know, because obviously this is a fundamental piece to be able to start piecing things together. Check. So this is a case that went before the VA. So this is a court case that went forward of Kaluza v. Brown. And Kaluza v. Brown is what defines service connection. So when you look at, we have here, we call the triangle because obviously there's 3 different things, so it makes it more memorable. But there are certain key elements that we need for service connection. Welcome to everybody who kind of came in. I know we have some folks that jumped in. So I think Jonathan's in the building. So thank you for being there. Carla's in the building. Thank you for being there. So Carla and Jonathan, in the chat, let us know the branch of service you were in and the years that you served, because we'll definitely pick you up. We just started, so you are correct and fine. So we'll make sure, like I said, we'll build any gaps. So we're talking about the fundamental pieces for a nexus letter. So the Kaluza triangle defines service connection. Now, one of the things that we have that we always hit on is a disability, when it's all said and done, is nothing more than a medical condition that has risen to the level of being disabling. And the reason I'm saying that is because oftentimes many here have heard things like, well, DP, can you look at my record? Or I went to sick call one time, can I file for that? And the question really actually needs to be reversed into the fact of what's impairing you right now, not what's just in my records. Because the reality is, if you went to sick call one time or got hurt one time, 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago, there's no compensation for that. And again, I'm bringing this up because I want us to get the same um, understanding. Let's see, the same understanding, for example, as far as how we're connecting something. So have being seen at some point in service, technically, let's say Jerry was injured. The reality is you were paid for that period of time. Now it's a crazy concept, but just follow me for a second. If we're going to talk about what happened during service, everyone here got paid for what happened during service because obviously you got paid on the 1st and 15th. Now the question is not so much, hey, I got hurt during service. Can I file for that? Well, no, because you got paid already for service. That's all being cared for. You had medical care, you had access to things. The conversation really is post service, are we dealing with anything that now is still lingering and is still um, bothering us or impairing us? That's a different conversation. So it's not so much, hey, I got hurt one time, but now where are we dealing with now? You fell off a truck, you had an injury or what have you, and now you're dealing with these ramifications all these years later. That's the first part. Now, if you do not have a current diagnosis, you are not going to be successful in this conversation of a VA claim. So you're not even in contention for a nexus letter because you don't even have a claim to argue. You have to have a diagnosis. So rule number one is no diagnosis, no service connection. You cannot file service connection unless you have a diagnosis of a medical condition. Now, this is where it gets interesting. And we're looking at this almost like a detective of sorts, right? You want to have the yellow in place, check diagnosis. Now, the in-service event or aggravation, for many of us here, you may not have it because for many of us, and again, we're all in confidence here. I know for a fact that Ron and Jerry and Dennis and company and George, back in those days, guess what? Look, you sucked it up and you drove on. We weren't sitting here just going to file paperwork and build up stuff, right? It was a different military. And it's not comparing, it's just being realistic that it's a different time. And even to today's day, right? It's just suck it up, drive on, change socks, drink Motrin. So when it's all said and done, most people are lacking the in-service event or stressor. You did not complain. You did not get seen. Ronnie jumped out of an aircraft how many times? And guess what? There's no records of you complaining about it because you had to suck it up. You had to be mission ready. So the fact is, there are instances where the record is lacking, but I'm here to tell you that that doesn't mean that there's no fighting chance. So this is where the blue comes into play. So I'm going to give you two scenarios. The very first one is someone who has records. So you have a diagnosis of migraines and you complained in service of migraines, check. If between the yellow and the red, we have a year separation, AKA you just got out of service recently, it's a pretty clear cut conversation because you're in that window. Now, let's take it to Dennis extreme. You've been out for 50 years. Now the conversation changes because of the fact that, hey, it's been a long time between yellow and red. So what took so long? Are other things factoring into that equation? So the nexus now becomes a strong piece. And as you see there, it's what basically is connecting something to be able to say the terms we've heard, at least as likely as not. And that comes from the probability part of the house, where if it's a 50-50 argument, the tie goes to the veteran. So that language of at least as likely as not is very crucial, and you'll see that as we proceed. So the blue, is connecting those pieces. So a nexus letter is helpful because if anyone here, right, again, let me know in the chat. Have you ever filed a claim, right, and got a response of denied, not service connected? If you've heard the magical word, I know it's triggering, so I want to ask it very lightly because it's like, well, how many times does that count? Because I've got it quite a few times, right? Where you filed a claim and the VA says not service connected. The one that adds injury to insult is veteran Palachuk. We recognize you have a disability, but not service connected. And you're like, wait a second. So you recognize I have a disability, but it's not service connected? So that's the other one too, because sometimes they will go ahead and say, yes, I do have, you do have a disability, but it's not our fault. So that goes back to the service connection piece. They're not saying you do not have the condition you have. They're just saying we're not liable for it, right? So that nexus now begins the process of connecting that. So in this scenario of someone who has those records, it's pretty much now a provider connecting your service to your current diagnosis. I mean, their diagnosis to the things in service you complained about. They're providing a medical opinion. I just got one for depression, anxiety, check, and we'll talk about that, Charles. So now think about this. this opinion from the medical provider is almost what you've all asked in some shape, fashion, or form, because you've been to a doctor, and I know Tito's been seen, and the doctor says, you know what, man, though that knee condition you have, that back condition you have, that's an old injury. You know what I'm saying? That's not new. Like doctors can tell, right? If you have orthopedic situation, et cetera, by the nature of the severity of what you're dealing with, they can tell whether this is a new thing or an old thing. The problem is they'll never say it's related to service. It's pretty easy to tell them, and they could probably concur with you in person, but they'll never actually write that. So this is where now the science comes in. Now, conversely, another scenario, you have a veteran who never complained in service. They have no records, right? And this is both for physical things or even mental health things. So consider now that you have someone with a current diagnosis of, patella tendonitis, or they have, some compressive disc issues and what have you, and some, physical things. Now, they may have never complained, but the body keeps the count and keeps the score. Any doctor, for example, who does an X-ray on, let's say, Jerry's back, can say, okay, you probably had a sustained certain level of injuries based off what I'm seeing in this X-ray, right? Now, whether or not, let's say, Brian and Dennis went to sick call post all the jumps from an aircraft, it doesn't necessarily. It adds, obviously, it's going to help the argument if you had those records, but not having it now, this nexus begins to add to the mix. Because what's going on here is, hey, even though, let's say, Ron and Dennis and Brian never complained about a condition, right? It is clear to see the level of wear and tear and damage they have is in line with X, Y, Z. So that's now where the Nexus letter, also that medical opinion, begins to bridge the gap of the lack of medical evidence. But understanding that frame of thought also helps, right? So it can connect the thing, and it can also begin to supplement the thing, because sometimes we know we don't have the red. Now, a more advanced conversation here that we'll dive in deeper as we proceed is when we're looking at the in-service event or aggravation. I want to focus bring your attention to the aggravation part. Now, this is the part where a lot of veterans get mixed up. Not everything is caused by military service. There are some things that are aggravated by military service. And that's there for a reason, specifically because when we start to look at, okay, well, how do I make this argument? It has to be made a certain way. So some things can be caused by service, but some things also are made worse by service, are aggravated by service. So when we start to look at, for example, secondaries, right? Does anyone not know what a secondary claim is? If you do not know, it's fine to let us know. But have you ever heard of the concept of a secondary claim? Or you may kind of know what it is, but maybe not too warm and fuzzy. And I can catch up here on some of the comments coming in. Tito has a few of those. George understands the denial part of the house. Charles says has several of those denials that have come in. Let's see. Benny knows that firsthand. Check, check, check. Let's see. Charles got one for depression, anxiety, especially sleep apnea. The VA diagnosed after service. Check. We'll talk about that one too, Ronnie. That's a big one. Yep, I did make check somewhat. Learned about that a year ago. I got a concept, but what makes it secondary? Check Armando. So, and that's a good point there. So when we're talking about secondaries now, let's take the example of someone who is injured, right? So we're using, let's say, the airborne concept here. Someone's jumping out of aircrafts, they fall down, they have this issue. They now have a problem with their left knee. That left knee is documented, it is service connected. Fast forward, the right knee is fine though. There's no issues there. Now, one in turn causes issues to the next. So secondary could be simply that my left knee now, right, over time, favoring it or favoring my right knee, has caused more wear and tear on my right knee, right? That's not something you can claim to service. Conversely, I have chronic pain. I take acids and acids and acids. The doctor says take a few of these for a few weeks, and you in turn take those antacids for 2 years. Well, guess what? Now you have, GI problems, lining problems, etc. That now is not something you can say the service caused, but it's secondary to something that's service connected. So if you consider it that way, it's what is something you are rated for that may have caused something else. I have my left knee that's service connected. I favor my right knee. I now have wear and tear on my right knee. My right knee now is worse than my left knee. Why is that the case? because I favored my right knee over my left knee that was messed up, and now my right knee is worse. So that conversation now creates an aggravation type of thing. It creates something that was caused secondary to it, right? So that's one concept. There are also some veterans, when we talk about aggravation, that came into service with a pre-existing condition. There are people who have had some issues and the service made it worse. So that's something that has to be noted, because let's say, Armando, in your case, you came in with flat foot. You cannot file a claim and say the service caused flat feet, because when they pull, the records, guess what? You had flat feet. You're denied. Versus the service made it worse. Now that's a different conversation. So understanding how things can get worse is a huge part here. So there are instances where something's caused by service. Again, Ronnie gets hit by a vehicle. Ronnie files a claim. It has records, files a claim. That was direct to service. You have a secondary condition that basically says not only now does he have a back condition, but that back condition now has caused him to have to take all his medication. Now, here's the part where I want you to kind of to kind of look at me for this. And let me put it this way here. All right. So and this is how you start looking at connecting things, right? And we're going to go back to this. So we're using Ronnie's case. I get hit by a vehicle. I have these issues. That in turn now has caused a back condition, right? I'm taking all these meds for this back condition. That has caused a GI condition. Now that GI condition has made it to where I'm having, let's say, adverse reactions, and I also have some depression is coming because of the fact that I have these issues. Then I also have some migraines that's coming because of these issues that I'm dealing with. So the concept of a secondary, right? And this is again crucial to Nexus letters. You can have various things linked together. So Ronnie has, let's say, that back condition, which in turn now we are having a conversation for secondary for GERD because of the antacid abuse used for chronic pain. That chronic pain has caused some level of, let's say, little hand here, has caused some level, let's say, of mental health that's a secondary to it. So the GERD is secondary to the back, let's say. The mental health is secondary to that. The migraines is secondary to that. So these things can be kind of put together like a chain reaction of sorts, if that kind of makes sense. Now I'm saying that because this is where it also gets complicated for a veteran who's been out of service for a period of time. Now, sticking with Ronnie as the example, if you've been out of service for a while, the same example, my back has caused some GERD. The GERD, I have some migraines. The migraines cause some depression because I have GERD, I have back pain, I have chronic pain. You have all these different things. The problem is this: if you ask Ronnie today, what are you dealing with? Well, Ronnie's probably going to tell you, these migraines are killing me. And the reality is, we can't just file for that migraine right now. We have to go backwards. What's caused the migraine? So that whole process of working our way backward is also part of this concept, because like it, right? Again, let's add another layer to it. If it's the knee that caused the left knee caused the right knee to have issues. Now both knees are bad, caused the back issue. The back issue is bad. You have now meds that came into it. Having to work backwards to the original thing that caused the entire domino effect is part of the strategy conversation. So that's where a lot of veterans get messed up, because they file for all these things. And the VA says, well, first of all, the migraine is not a problem. The mental health is not our problem. The GERD is not our problem. We don't connect that back to service, because the original thing that was the issue was your knee and your back. Once we have the knee and the back, then we make the process of going for the secondary. So this concept of how we're making the service connection is crucial, because there's two ways to look at this. Can Ronnie file a claim for his knee and his back and then put secondaries to the other conditions? Sure. But if they deny the knee and the back, all the secondaries are wiped out. Versus do the knee and the back first, get those on first base, then we go for the other conditions secondary to them. So staggering things, you know what I'm saying, is part of the strategy here. So that's really what this is all about. So you have to have a diagnosis. If you have the in-service event or aggravation, great. But if you don't, we can work backwards. This also applies to mental health. There are instances where PTSD can take place, and a veteran, for example, does not have events or did not get seen in service or what have you. So that's fine. So in this instance here, that can be worked backwards as well. So a very extreme example of this would be something like um, uh, MST, military sexual trauma. So if we have something like MST, there's not going to be at times records in the system. So the same way we just looked at the fact that x-rays for your back can be used to point that, hey, even though you never went to get seen, it's obvious your wear and tear is related to service. The same thing can happen for mental health. You never complained or never came forward that you experienced a personal attack or a military sexual trauma or something, in the mental health range happen. But fast forward, the symptoms are there. And that's what we call markers, right? And we'll touch on that later as well. But just to point out the fact that we can work this backwards, almost like a crime scene. So if all the pieces are not there in this triangle, we can then make a point to begin to supplement what's needed. So that's part of the first triage. So again, back to Ronnie's example in this case here, we have to assess where you're at. So when Ronnie says, "Hey, what can I do to file a claim?" It's not so easy to just say, "Well, do this," because first of all, it's where are you, right? What are you dealing with? What's going on with you to be able to put together a solid argument? So we go back to your workbook. That's part of the reason you see that what we look at here is understanding, right? Where are you? What are the things that you are dealing with? What are some of the things that you're trying to work through? Because obviously we have to know, what's the plan going forward. Okay. So I want to pause there real quickly and kind of, open it up to make sure to see if we have any questions on the concept of um, uh, the Kaluza triangle, service connection, and so forth. So if there are any questions, definitely feel free to raise your hand. Let me know. I want to make sure that we at least kind of have a check on that there as far as that's concerned. So I see you, Charles, there, but I want to make sure again that we have a good understanding for folks, because if you don't know, you don't know. And that's the biggest thing here, right? We want to make sure that you're able to really understand how we're getting to these conclusions and how we're putting together strategies. So I'll give it a second to make sure that we get everybody to be good there. So give me a thumbs up as needed. Jerry, you have your hand up, I think. Yes. Let's see. So the other thing I have, okay, check. I have back issues, musculoskeletal. Nothing wrong, carried. Check. Okay, got it. Got it. Muscles, not skeletal. I've had. Yep. Yeah. So that starts to go into like chronic pain and so forth there, which is crazy because I made a whole story, which I made up, by the way, of Ronnie, and that was actually completely made up. And now we see that some of it might have been true. So there's that part. So we start to look at so that's secondaries there, right? So a good question now that came in is, what is a supplemental? So secondary, we understand that. So everybody thumbs up, good on on secondary, correct? Something service connected, something secondary that was caused secondary to it. Now, another concept of supplemental. Anybody not clear on what that is before I answer, just to kind of make sure.
Oh, no, we're okay.
So supplementals specifically is when we start to look at, let's say, a claim. So in, let's say your case, we'll still with Ronnie's for this block right here. You file a claim, you are denied, right? And you, like you just said, like in people have said things like that. So you've been denied. So how do we push back? So understanding what we just talked about for service connection, there are different ways to appeal something. So everybody here obviously has been denied, sadly, in some shape, fashion, or form. If you've been denied, there are a few ways to appeal. You can go higher level, you can go supplemental, or you can go to the board, right? Those are the main three tracks. Now, if you're going to go higher level, it just means a second pair of eyes are going to look at your claim. Ronnie, you cannot go higher level, because if you were missing things and they denied you for that, a higher level is going to identify the exact same thing. So a higher level set means you cannot add anything to it. So let's say in your case, Ronnie, you had no Nexus letter, you had no additional medical opinion. A higher level review means now someone else is going to look at the claim, another rater, and they're going to identify the same missing crucial piece. So a higher level only applies if everything that was supposed to be there is in there. So Ronnie, let's say, is missing certain things in his claim, and it's, we take a look at it, have a conversation. I'm like, Ronnie, you're missing 3 things. This is not going to fly the way it is. Whereas, let's say Jerry has what he needs. Like, no, you're solid. Everything is in there. High level review. The rater got it wrong. So he doesn't have to add things to it because he has what he needs. So now yeah, correct. So a supplemental claim is now we're supplementing. So what happened with the new Appeals Modernization Act is they added a new way to appeal things. So now Ronnie, when he wants to appeal a denial, he can supplement the claim. So you cannot file for the claim again. You have to supplement it. When Ronnie supplements it, now he gets a Nexus letter, right? He gets a medical opinion to add to the conversation, right? Can you just file again? Or no, correct. You have to appeal it. So anything that was denied has to be appealed. If you try to file the claim like if you try to file again, the VA is going to close it down because they already denied it. So they're not going to relook at your paperwork in Ronnie's case, right? So now what's going to happen is you have to supplement it. So supplemental means I'm adding to, right? We're supplementing information. So when Ronnie now files a claim, an appeal via the supplemental line, right? So a supplemental means the way you're going to appeal something, you're adding now additional evidence. That additional evidence could be more records, IMOs, Nexus letters, personal statements, additional things that were missing in the previous claim, or to clarify. And you'd be surprised. It could be many reasons why someone gets denied. It could be you had no diagnosis. Denied because you don't have a diagnosis formally of a thing, for example, right? So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So when we're talking about appeals, anything you filed that was denied has to be appealed. You cannot file it again. Now, if you were denied, you can go higher level, supplemental, or to the board. The board we reserve as a last resource because that's going to the judge and that's a whole process there. So between a higher level and a supplemental, those are the two lines that a veteran really can be dynamic with. And we'll touch on that a little more with some resources and strategy as we proceed. But just to put it in context, if you were denied, it has to go to an appeal. And if we're missing things, supplemental is the initial way to go. And then from there, we'll talk tactics as well. Let's see here. When sick call 4 years straight, back issues till denied it. I have claim was denied for 8 years ago. Medical proof, rolling appeal. Yep. A claim that was denied 8 years ago. Medical proof to get the ball rolling. It's an appeal. Right. So it's an appeal. And in the appeal lane, you have supplemental, higher level, and the board. So it's all the same thing, just to clarify it for you, Jonathan. So if you're going to appeal something, how do you appeal it? You appeal it via a higher level, you appeal it via supplemental, or you appeal by going to the board. I want to talk to a judge. Okay, so just to make sure that we're clear on that one. So supplemental is the way to go for you with certain things that we're going to add to the conversation. And as far as Ronnie, things that were missed for that, we'll also kind of cover that here as well. So those are the main pieces there that I want to make sure that we emphasize back to this part here, because it gives us the groundwork as to how we begin the process of making the argument for this Nexus letter. So this is what service connection is all about. So the biggest takeaway here is even if you don't have all the pieces for service connection, we can supplement whatever is needed. I'm using the word supplement, not in the appeal side, just saying we're adding to, right? So whatever's missing, we can reinforce these buckets, right? As we go through that whole process there. Now, when we start to look at the actual Nexus letter, right, we understand the role that it plays in this conversation. So when we begin the process of looking at this, now we look at the 4 key elements that a Nexus letter must include. Now, there are key things that a Nexus letter has to have. Check on the comments. I was just making sure I missed something. I'll see Nayeli's just answering certain things there, so that's fine. Let's see here. We go pull this up. So when it comes to the Nexus letter, again, there are certain things that have to be in there to be successful, right? So we have 4 key elements, and we'll show you also what those things are when we begin to look at the sample letters that we have too, and those are also in your book. So kind of seeing it this way will help make sense. So when we actually see the sample ones, it'll kind of start all coming together. So the first thing we're looking at here, obviously, is review of pertinent records, medical records for said claim. So this is one of the first parts here, and I think I can actually jump and use one of the samples. So this concept here, and again, this is now when we're looking at the actual letter, whether you're requesting someone to write it or you are paying someone who's going to write you one, right? One of the first blocks here is the review of a veteran's pertinent medical records. It might seem very simple, But if this line is not part of the letter, you're pretty much already up, you're up blank creek to a degree. Because how can I write a letter for Ron without having reviewed his medical records or service records? And now, granted, if his service records are lacking certain things, that's one thing. But if I don't make mention that I've reviewed his medical record, as simple as it sounds, well, guess what? How can I make an opinion on something? So again, I'm now the doctor writing the letter for Ronnie. I have to make sure said letter has key language in it. So if I jump over to the sample side of the house, right? And again, this is a template where obviously, if you're going to go to your doctor, you can pre-draft it and be able to explain what's needed. But you see that there's a flow here of certain things. So down here, you see this part down to what we're just talking about, right? After review of the veteran's pertinent medical record, my professional opinion is blase blase. But now again, that review part is crucial because again, you see it here in some shape, fashion, or form being repeated, right? I've also reviewed the veteran's records. If we're not doing that, if this is not on the letter, and again, sometimes some doctors may want to write a letter for you and they might not want a template or they may want to go about it their own way, but there's a flow of what has to be in this. So if you look at it, right, and that's what we're breaking down by parts, it's pretty standard letterhead, doctor, whatever the case may be, date, reference, veteran's name, information, to whom it may concern, I, Dr. DP, and writing a board, I'm a certified board specialist. I'm a cardiologist. I'm a fill in the blank, what have you. My credentials include are, etc. So I have to justify who I am, right? But when it comes specifically to the fact that I'm writing a letter to this veteran, right, it pretty much starts the process of saying, hey, I reviewed this veteran's record. I'm going to make an opinion, but I have to have reviewed it. And it may seem so simple, but you'd be surprised where if that's not in there and the VA in turn makes an opposing, position on something, well, how can you determine and say something if you haven't reviewed it? Because we've reviewed the veteran's record, which says the opposite. Or we've seen their medical records and we're saying this. And the fact that that key element of, hey, I've assessed the situation, right, is missing, that's a problem. So does that kind of that obviously should be pretty simple there. But one key element of the Nexus letter here is to make sure, obviously, that we have the I've reviewed, right? So you see that here on the sample that's on page 18 of your workbook. And again, this is one that you can kind of use as sample. You can kind of draft it up for your provider and kind of go through that process. Or if you, let's say, get one, you want to look for some of these key elements that are in there, right? So understanding how to read these things. So I've introduced who I am. I've made a point to say, hey, this is what I've done, right? So check on, we reviewed the records of the veteran, because again, that's a big one, because it's an argument to the VA pretty much administratively about a record review. Let's see. Do most doctors have it? No, they do not. And that's the whole thing. This concept of when we're talking, while caveat, when we're talking disability opinions and Nexus letters, one of the biggest issues for especially civilian doctors is they think disability, Social Security disability. They think, that side of the house. And when we're talking Social Security disability, that's a very different conversation versus an opinion. So for many civilian doctors, when you're asking to write you a letter, you got to think about it. If a doctor has 1,000 patients and 20 of them are going through a disability process, maybe only 2 of them are veterans. So the overwhelming information they have when it comes to disabilities is Social Security. Whereas when it comes to the veteran side of the house, we're not saying that you're putting your credentials up to par. We're not saying that this is a Social Security disability situation. This is a opinion that the VA is using as to whether or not there's a probability that this is related to my service. That's it. It's an opinion. They're not being called in by the VA. Their credentials are not being challenged. It's not one of those things. Because again, we're talking now disability. And in the real world, Medicare, Medicaid is very different from Social Security. So healthcare is different from disability. And a lot of doctors want nothing to do with that. So if you get into a car crash or something happens and you want your doctor to help you in that disability process, many of them will run the other way because they want no parts of the disability, journey. So when it comes to that, that's what they see. They see a lot of those things that happen in the real world, or the civilian world, rather, not the real world, the civilian world. So when we're talking, framing to them what exactly we're asking is huge. So that's why even having, for example, a sample like this, and this is specific to you, um, was that Ronnie? Yep. They don't have Nexus letters because they don't even understand what this even is. They don't understand what a Nexus is. So really, we're using the word Nexus, but it's an opinion. But not knowing how the opinion is supposed to be put together, what it is, it pretty much makes it to where they're not comfortable. So if I go back, for example, now, and I have a pre-drafted, I can explain to the doctor, hey, what this is. Think about how much more successful I am, me and Ronnie can be now if I now am able to explain, hey, here's a sample of what I'm asking you to do. As you see here, it's strictly that. It's an opinion, right? You have professional experience. You can explain better what you're asking. They can see what it is, right, that has to be done. And like most doctors, if they can see the sample of something in a go by, it makes life easier. But if you want them to write something from scratch, here's the reality. If you've ever worked at a doctor's office, the doctor's not writing anything. It's literally the admin staff who's doing everything. Like when you went to a doctor and you asked for like a doctor's note or something for your job, the doctor didn't write that. It was the front office, right? It's admin. And it goes to the doctor, he signs off on it. So really, if they understand what's being drafted here, they're much more inclined to support and sign off on this. And we've had success with this because they see what they're signing, they see what they're doing, and in turn, it makes sense. Because I'm not going to just, first of all, if I don't know what I'm writing for you, I love to help you, Ronnie, but I don't have time for that. I don't feel comfortable because I don't understand, right? You don't feel comfortable because you don't understand. So exactly, Jonathan. So the secretary now, let's say admin staff, secretary, et cetera, is able to understand and see a template that makes life a whole lot more easier. So that's the first point there, right? And we'll talk about as well the VA side of the house and mandates for them too. So what we're actually we'll touch on that too. So we're talking doctors in general, but then we'll talk about VA doctors and their hesitation. To Naomi's point there, it's not so much they have an option. This is something they have to do. Right. So we've established this part here. So part one, we're looking at the review of veterans' pertinent records. Check. Now we're going into the professional opinion. Right. What is the degree of likelihood that the condition is related to military service? Right? So if we go back to our Nexus letter example, right? We've established what is it that is in that first part. So let's go back here because I want to show that in our workbook. And you should all see here. So we've established the fact that now we're moving into what is the likelihood, right? Now, reading through it, again, very simple. Some of these can be very detailed and much more elaborate. And towards the end, I'll pull up one for a complex situation just to give you what an actual professional looks like as well. But so we've established this is who I am. My credentials have been included. Sometimes they can write out who they are. Some providers are fine giving their resume, things of that such. So you may have seen things like that. Writing in support of this veteran, I have reviewed their records. And in turn, now I'm making a point to put certain things, which include, XYZ, years of service, while in service, et cetera. This person's a person under my care, diagnosis, of XYZ. And again, you're seeing that basically I'm establishing here, or what's being established is the fact that they have, familiarity with your condition. So now when you start to look at, what exactly is it that they feel is going on here, right? This is where we start to look at that. So after review of the pertinence, the veterans pertinent record, my professional opinion is what is the likelihood? So this is key because of the way the VA looks at things on this side of the house. So it's one of those things where again you've heard something like at least as likely as not, or more likely than not, or due to. And this is the key thing. Most doctors, and again, this is a quick hack here, just to at least help you all should you need to have this conversation. If I'm looking at this line here, which I'm kind of highlighting, right? That has to go towards the top here, right? So I'm saying after review, right? This is my opinion and the likelihood. So I reviewed Ronnie's records. I know him. I understand his medical condition. And after reviewing it, my professional opinion, right, is at least as likely as not, more than likely it's not, due to. At least as likely as not means 50-50. And the reason we're giving you this is because think about it. And I don't want to make this sound like it's a car situation, but everybody here has been to, has bought a vehicle at some point, right? And you've been to a car lot and they've tried to sell you a vehicle. And most good car salesmen, right, will show you a car that's way out of your price range. And they may show you a car that is way beneath your price range with the goal of getting to the car right in the middle that they were always trying to get you to. Right. So you're not going to walk out of there with the $80,000 car. You're not going to walk out of there with the $500 car, but you're more comfortable buying the $20,000 car. Had they just given you the option for the 20,000, maybe you would have been kind of hesitant. Right. So there's a process for that. The reason I'm saying that is this: if they understand, right, back to the likelihood side of the house, that there are options here, here's the reality. Due to means it is unequivocal this is something that's happened to service. The extreme example I use is this: if I literally lost a leg due to an IED, it is pretty clear as day that the reason I lost my leg is due to service. There is no ifs, ands, or but about it. We can all agree on that, correct? Now, we cannot say that my IBS is strictly due to service. There's many other factors: lifestyle, dietary constraints, genetic makeup, etc. So when you look at something like due to, it's a very strong statement that, again, if we phrase it of saying, hey, look, I understand, doc, you can't say the military caused this, because that's usually hesitation. Hey, Ronnie, I'd love to help you, but I don't feel comfortable. I just can't really say because, you never know. I understand, doc. You can't say it was due to service because many other things could have made my back situation worse. But in your opinion, would you say that it's 50-50 that the service could have caused it? Well, yeah, I'm comfortable saying that. Well, that's at least as likely as not. Or more than likely than not. Like, you know what? I'm pretty sure this is service connected, Ronnie. I may not be able to say definitively, but I'm pretty confident this is definitely something that's not normal. You literally, were airborne, jumped out of aircraft, did all that stuff. You left the military and you literally went to a desk job for the last 20 years. Your whole body, your whole lifestyle has been sedentary after service. So it's pretty clear to see that this might have been a thing, right? And based off x-rays and all these things, the wear and tear on your body, this is an injury you've had for a while. So by having the option of saying at least as likely as not, again, I'm highlighting it here, more likely than not, or due to, you now are giving the doctor options. Again, back to the car salesman thing. They know they want you to buy the $20,000 vehicle, but you have to make the decision and feel like you're in control. So the fact that you're not just telling a doctor what to do because they spent 13 plus years, 15 years going to college and paid, six figures for that degree, they're not in the business of taking orders from patients. So we have to understand what we're dealing with, right? Like, you get more bees with honey than with vinegar type of thing, right? So the fact that we're giving them options of saying, hey, I understand that you may not say, I can't say it's due to, but again, at least it's likely, more than likely, if they have the option, they feel more comfortable to give an opinion because they're telling you these things, like this looks like it definitely could be related to service, but I can't, be 100% on it. I don't need you to be 100%, doc, because unlike social security disability, for VA purposes, it's a 50-50 conversation. At least as likely as not means 50-50. If the argument is 50-50, the tie goes to the veteran. Does that make sense? In the chat real quick, just to make sure that we're tracking on that. Catch up here. Armando, so I'll tell you what, before I got rated, I'd never stepped foot in the VA. Like literally all my ratings I got without having to ever touch foot in the VA. So that's, and I'll talk about VHA, BVA here in a second as well. But that's not uncommon. You'd be surprised. So I think we should be cool on that here. Just before the Army, never injured, did 9 years, aggravated doing military service. Will they look at it or should I try to claim it? No, check. So that could, if you got like your back adjusted, like what, chiropractic, things like that. If it's chiropractic adjustments, and yeah, that's just maintenance and stuff. It's if you had like scoliosis or something egregious, you would not be able to go into service. So that's not something that's gonna, be a factor like went to the chiropractor. So no, that's fine. The doctors, yep. So we'll hit on that here as well too. So that's that part there, as far as the likelihood aspect. So, but just so everybody's kind of clear on this point here, the degree of likelihood to military service, again, that goes into the professional opinion. So we have that understanding. We know what that is. Now, the rationale for opinion, this is where it gets a little complicated because there are some doctors who are, again, we were talking to specialists. So for example, and this is where I'll pull up here when we get to the end, also some PubMeds and different things like that. what is the rationale, right? Now, when you have some professionals who are writing some of these letters, they sometimes get really into the weeds, and we can kind of discuss some of that. But for example, sleep apnea came up. If we do a PubMed research, for example, or try to find information on that, there are studies out there in literature showcasing that for veterans, it is a likely thing that they have experienced things like sleep apnea. So, right, so there's a prevalence, for example, of sleep apnea with veterans. So let me see here. And this is just to kind of give some credence to the rationale. So really, this is what is the reason for saying this? And again, this it can some doctors can go very extreme. Some doctors can be very simple as far as being able to put that information out there as far as this is concerned. So let me see sleep apnea. Because I want to bring this up here to kind of show you all this. And then we'll put veterans. Has anyone ever seen? Let's see here. This. Where is it? I'm gonna pull up this sleep study. So and there's many ones that can be pulled in different ways here. But this is an example of PubMed. Has anyone not ever seen PubMed or like medical literature? If you haven't, it's okay. So I can kind of show you what that is. I'll give it a second for folks to kind of take a look at this here. But looking at the National Library of Medicine, and just again, this is a study that talks on sleep apnea among survivors of combat-related traumatic injury, and it talks about veterans and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways to be able to look at this and do searches in like PubMed and things of this such. If I say, for example, sleep apnea, and I say veterans, it'll literally give me a rundown of sleep asthma, sleep apnea overlap, and so forth. You know, things related to the veteran community and what have you. So it'll bring up different things that are actually in our demographic. So what I'm showing this here is sometimes some vets will go and start looking at, are there medical literatures that connect, you know, things like sleep apnea to veterans? Is there a higher prevalence of sleep apnea with, you know, the veteran population? So there are studies out there. So when we start to look at rationale, right? Sleep apnea in women veteran results, so forth, sleep apnea disturbances in veterans with chronic war, PTSD. So there's studies out there, is my whole point. So if a veteran begins the process of looking up the conditions they're dealing with, I'm using sleep apnea as an example, these are things that can be used in the rationale side. And again, it doesn't mean it's necessary. It's just adding to the conversation because again, you're pulling medical literature. It doesn't mean you have this thing. It's just saying here are instances where this has been shown to be the case. So when we start to look at the medical opinion side of the house, that begins to add to it. So we will see instances going back to the Nexus sample here, where the Nexus letter, for example, not only has, for example, the likelihood aspect, but it also begins the process of saying, you know, in my professional medical opinion, right, medical literature is known to give blah, blah, blah. So this last line here now begins to go into that. So I reviewed, again, Ronnie, your record. This is who I am. In my opinion, it is least likely it's not. And I'm saying that because it is known that among veterans, right, the wear and tear of XYZ, whatever literature here, that's that the third, right? And again, there are some providers who are, again, specialists and are aware of these things. And sometimes veterans in their regular care are able to show their doc, like, look, this is a known thing. It's like, oh, yeah, that's definitely a known thing in medical literature, in journals, right? This is their library. This is what they do, right? They may not be versed in all things veteran, but again, whether or not they are referencing their own opinion or they want to pull medical literature, that goes in there as well. And really well crafted, excuse me, Nexus letters actually make a point to begin to break that down. So you see how, excuse me, this whole thing begins to, you know, kind of come in sections. And the reason we're hitting it this way too is I want to make sure that whether or not your own provider is writing you a letter or you're paying someone to write you a letter, you know what to look for. And it makes sense because if it makes sense to you, you also have a fighting chance of being able to speak to your provider about what it is you are dealing with. Um, Yeah, well, yeah, and that's that's literally the $1 million question, Ronnie. And that's really literally what's like, okay, why is it so difficult going up this mountain with the VA? But that's literally the pain in the butt when it comes to doing all these different things. So, and one of the last points when we start to look at again the sleep apnea side of the house, I mean not sleep apnea, uh Nexus Letter, right, is the credentials of the author, right? When we start to look at the credentials, this is key because I'm of the mindset where if your general practitioner wants to support you, that's fine. But if we start to look at, wait a second, the credentials of the individual, and you see that towards the end, again, there's different ways that folks can present it. You'll see that at the bottom sometimes or the top, they introduce who they are. But you're going to have more weight, obviously, being looked at if a neurologist is, let's say, the person, right, who's actually willing to write you a letter because of the fact that they have that background, or someone who specializes in those things. So when you see some of these letters, you'll see instances where someone, for example, begins to talk about their experience in certain things, right? Not only do they have this background, and again, it could be, let's say, a physician assistant, a PA who has extensive training and background in, cardiovascular, XYZ, whatever the case may be. And basically what gives them the, authority to give this opinion, right? So obviously you don't want a dentist writing a letter for your back, right? So making a point to make sure we have obviously folks that are there, because even to Ronnie's point, we understand that we're dealing with sadly a system that is almost looking for any reason to pull um a reason to push back on things. And then here's the sad part. And this is one of the things that we'll table for the end discussion towards the end, but we also have instances where the VA is hiring and has people who are making decisions on claims who are not well versed. If you've seen some of the content we put out, there's instances and issues at the VA with their failures in rating people correctly, calling people back for needed exams. And we have to understand what's happening actually. You have raters that, quite frankly, just don't know what they're doing, literally. And I'm not saying that to be negative. I'm saying that from the perspective, zooming out here for a second, that part of the reason of our success, and I was literally having this conversation yesterday with one of our advisors, is we almost are teaching our veterans how to advocate for themselves to a point that actually is more in line with what should happen compared to who's making the decision. In English, that means this: some of our veterans are better versed in some of this than some of the people making decisions. Like, we know people who are raiders that we've talked to. We know many of them. We had a call this week with a few, and trying to explain to them what's happening or hearing the rationale. It's like, I hear what you're saying, but it is literally one of those, man, you don't even know what you're saying sometimes. And the inconsistencies in that. We literally, I think it was Amy and I were talking. Uh, we have people that we know who have family members who have been hired by the system. And when you hear who got hired to be a raider at the GS level, it's like, well, first of all, you have no background, you didn't even serve, you're not aware of this, and here's the kicker. And I've known this before, but the word clicked for me a few days ago. I want you all just to take a second and just pause and look at what we're doing. Right, we're having a workshop, we're having an iterative conversation. We're here live doing this, and you're learning something, and you're asking questions. Does anyone here know what the letters OLC means? Have you ever had to take an OLC course? Does that make any sense to anyone? If it doesn't, that's fine, because uh, this is the part that'll be interesting to share. OLC. OLC is a concept that the government uses, again, as a retired, government employee. It's how the government trains their people. It's online learning courses. So when the military, like back in the military, right, when we had to do something, it was death by PowerPoint, right? Private Snuffy did something dumb. Guess what? Safety brief everybody, lottie dottie, and here we go. In the government, that doesn't happen. So we have OLCs, which means it's mandatory for everybody here in this room to get their OLCs done by the end of the quarter so we can say we're up to speed on whatever the requirement for training is. A lot of these raiders that are being hired are being pushed through the OLC practicum. AKA they have to complete online courses at their own self-paced process by a certain period of time to mark off the certification of what they know. So if the training that they're going through is one of those little online courses that they just have to advance through scenario based and then move on to the next, think about how much you would learn out of that. If this workshop was an online click a thing, pick a scenario, pick the right answer, a little blurb, and move on to the next, how much would you get out of that? That's what's happening on the other side. This is what's rating you. These are the folks that are being hired at an alarming rate by the VA and how they're training them. It's not classroom report at 9. We're going into the books of how this works. It's we have to hire you. You're getting to work, you do some training, and then you do OLC things. That's the reality. Look it up online. Talk to someone, ask a question. So, check Charles. So now think about it, right? So if we know what OCs are, you know for a fact that you get it wrong, do it again, you get it wrong, do it again, you get it wrong, do it again, you get it wrong, do it again. On the fourth try, you got it right. Some of these online courses don't have a fail rate. So again, my point is that if that's what is on the other side, consider then why we're going into some of these details and how we're serving up a claim to the VA fully developed that has all the key requirements. So we're in favor of submitting full developed claims because of the fact that you're almost having to teach some of these raters kind of almost what needs to be in there. You're serving it to them on a silver platter. Things that, Ronnie, to your point, why does it need to be so difficult? Because you're dealing with a good amount of ignorance and incompetence, sadly. That's what it is, right? At the end, I'll show some of the OIG reports that came out, but how they're calling people back for exams, what they're doing, it's just a slew of incompetence and ignorance that's happening. So if we're dealing with that, how then we, go through this process? So when we are looking at these concepts and how a veteran can be successful and explain some of the process, it sucks that we have to go this granular sometimes, but it's in the veteran's benefit to do that thing. Let's see. So the update to the medical issues corrected. How long does it take to get around, fix it? As far as update to the issue, as far as the claim going in, make sure I understand the question there. All right, wait for it to come through. Yeah. Yes, I'll tackle that here in a second. So again, to kind of reframe back, so that's the main point there as far as the why we kind of hammer on some of these details. So understanding, those key elements, again, back to the sample letter that we have in your workbooks, that's really some of the main points that we want to make sure that are in there, right? We want to make sure that you have the providers who are identifying themselves. We want to make sure that they are, stating key things like they have reviewed the veteran's record, right? Because without that, obviously the veteran is not in a good place. What is the professional opinion? What is the rationale for their opinion? And who are they to be able to talk about these things, right? So, and again, we talk about and hit on the point of, at least as likely as not. And this is what we now begin to look at as the VA standard of proof. So, at least as likely as not versus less likely, right? It's pretty much is it more than 50% or is it less? Those are the two key things here. Because when you get a denial letter from the VA, right, you'll see sometimes language like less likely, because they're saying that the likelihood of the condition you file for is not service connection. They found that blah, blah, blah is less likely than not due to military service. So that whole rationale of the denial, they're utilizing these things. Or let's say you were awarded at this, percentage and not at this one because the symptoms weren't there or what have you. So again, those are the things that I want to impress upon everyone to understand, because if you understand these things and know how to speak to that, that's going to give you an example as far as how to best advocate for yourself when it comes to um, getting support from, let's say, your medical provider. And we're also going to touch on, obviously, letters from the VA and mandates that are there in place for them as well. All right. So with that being said and done, does this kind of make sense as far as the, some of the breakdown of the elements of the Nexus letter and the standard of proof. Again, this is the big part that everybody always looks at, right? Because sometimes a veteran says, hey, doc, I just need a letter that says that this is at least likely as not due to service, because I heard somebody say at least as likely as not. Yes, that's a key part, but if the other fundamental parts are not there, you're still missing other things. Like, okay, well, who are you to say at least as likely as not? What is your rationale for at least as likely as not? Have you even reviewed this veteran's record to be able to give that at least as likely as not, opinion? So those are the key things that we want to make sure that are in there. But I want to pause for a second just to make sure that at least up to this point, what we've discussed and looked at here on the Nexus Letter side of the house kind of makes sense. I want to bring this back up to kind of show it and just kind of open it up real quick for any questions on this sample here. You can type in questions or raise your hands. Just kind of at least get a quick, status check on folks. Let's see, Nayeli, any alibis up to this point here before we proceed, or Brian?
No, sir.
Check.
All good here.
Okay.
All
good
good here.
Awesome.
Gravy.
All right. So we've established that part there. And then I want to jump over here. Let's see here. Okay. All right, so we have that, and I want to jump back onto the workbook side of the house where we were. So we looked at the Nexus Letter. Everybody has this, and you'll see that. Ronnie, yep. I see your hand raised. Give me a second.
Yeah, so I heard it on mute.
There you go.
So kind of going back, and then you guys may go through it.
Mhm.
But again, I've never been to a civilian doctor outside of the VA
Mhm.
unless it's part of community care.
Mhm.
So when I go searching for an outside provider, just finding one that does like Nexus statements, I mean, it feels kind of weird just going to a doctor say, hey, I need a Nexus statement, or hey, do you have to like really be seen by them,
You want
or
you go.
I guess I'm
So
confused on the
you,
whole
you don't
process.
really have to, so you have three options. You really don't have to be seen by the provider that is writing you the letter, because there are companies that's all they do, medical consulting companies that review records for veterans to provide medical opinions. So they don't have to be your treating physician, which is the same thing where you go to a VA doctor. That VA doctor who is going to evaluate you is not your treating physician. So the doctor who writes the Nexus for you is not the same as your treating doctor. Is it better to have a treating doctor do it? Absolutely, because they know your history, but it's not required. Whereas that's the best option, that doesn't mean that your doctor is going to cooperate. That's where a lot of veterans see where my doctor won't write me one. My doctor doesn't know how to write me one. My doctor is willing to help me, but we don't know what's needed. It's common, especially if you're in an area where you are not in a heavily populated veteran community and the doctors aren't used to seeing veterans. Whereas, that's one of your options. Your treating physician is willing to write you a letter. Now, after the workshop, you're equipped with everything that you need to work with your doctor. Fine, they'll write your letter. Cool. It has more probative value, which DP will touch on that, for it to come from your treating physician. But again, it's not required. You have a VA doctor who will tell you, I can't do it because it's a conflict of interest, or I can't do it because I don't have time to do it, which we have heard that. That's not true. The VA does have an obligation to help you. And again, DP will cover that. The VA doctor has an obligation to help you. It's not an option. It's not I can't. It's a conflict of interest, or I don't know how to. The VA is mandated to help you with this. The VA doctor, what you go to, they're also not a treating physician. So again, going back to probative value, it's on what you're able to put in that letter. Sometimes people are like, well, you don't need a Nexus letter because the VA is going to do that for you. Yes and no. Again, later on, Larry maybe will let me go into a little bit of detail of his case, but Because of probative value, Larry was able to win his claim from a non-treating physician because the Nexus letter, all it comes down to is the medical rationale. Medically, why does your sleep apnea make sense to be connected to your PTSD? Medically, why do your headaches are connected? Why are your headaches connected to your tinnitus? So it's not about your treating physician. It's not iffy to have a medical consulting company do it. They're really what they're looking are the 4 elements of the service connection that DP just covered. They're looking at what records were reviewed. They're looking at what condition is being evaluated. They're looking at the medical opinion. Is it at least as likely as not? Or are they looking at who did this? If you're doing let's say a back condition, obviously the credentials of an orthopedic, or I'm sorry, like of an optometrist is not going to be valid for an orthopedic condition. So they're looking at those 4 elements, and it doesn't matter who wrote it or if they're a treating physician, as long as that letter covers those 4 components or requirements, you're good to go.
Yep.
Does that make sense,
So-
Ronnie?
Right. So let's hit the elephant in the room, which is the VA side of the house. So does well, obviously most folks may not know this. So I'm going to show you here a directive from the VA. Again, this is going to be in your handouts as well. So let's jump to that. Has anyone ever heard of VA Directive 1134? Most folks obviously have not, but obviously it's just good to ask. But VA Directive 1134. This is a sample of what you're requesting to a VA provider to do something. This is coming actually from this. So there actually is a VA directive. And again, we'll give you access to this information. The template in your workbook has a sample of this. But really, I want to just impress upon you this. This is a provision for medical statements and completion of forms by VA health providers. Back to the point where we're saying, well, how can you say that the VA has to do something? Where do you get off? Where does that say that? Well, in their own internal documentations. The VHA, Veterans Health Administration Directive, establishes policy for healthcare providers, VHA, aka VA doctors, no matter what department, when requested and consistent with other VA policies to assist patients in completing Department of VA documentation, right? And non-VA medical forms, and provide patients with medical statements with respect to their medical conditions and functionalities. Now, that's the foreword there. Let's go to the actual policy. So we go to the actual policy itself. It pretty much speaks to that. Except when specifically prohibited, it's the VA's policy that providers, when requested, must assist patients in completion of VA and non-medical records. That's the policy. Everything else, when it comes to, for example, what's on here and all this other, medical legal jargon, is all responsibilities and how they do a thing. But this is the policy, all right? Like literally, it's 12 pages, but this is the whole point. Right. So when it comes to how, we put together policies and how that works, in government speak, it's a whole lot of everything to be able to satisfy requirements. But this is what it comes down to. And of course, to kind of break it down for you all, again, when these memorandums and directives are put coming from a government background, you literally have, and again, this is amended for May 11, 2020, VHA Directive 1134. So it gives you the purpose. What's the purpose of this? What's the background? Why is this doing something, right? Additionally, completion of medical forms by medical health providers, based on examinations or knowledge of veterans, blah, 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 under Title 38. So it's giving you the background of why it begins to talk about definitions. What is an assessment? What is a DBQ? A disability benefit questionnaire is a standardized VA document tool used to provide pertinent medical information, functional capabilities. It breaks down all these terms and definitions that are in the policy, but the whole gist, right, without having to read the whole policy to you, is literally this. The policy is simply that when Veterans Network Champions Club is our company, is who we are, VNCC. When a veteran asks for something like this, right, it's not just, oh, my VA doc doesn't want to do this. It doesn't matter so much what you don't want to do. It's your own directive of what you have to support. But if you don't know how to ask for a thing, or you don't know what your rights are, right, then how do you know how to push back, how to punch back? So the point is, it's obviously something that's here mandated that they have to do. And they talk about all these different things and examples of VA medical forms to be completed upon a patient or beneficiary request that are not limited to things like, oh, wait a second, what is this? A disability benefit questionnaire? You're helping me with my disability stuff? Oh, I don't feel comfortable doing that. Well, I don't really care whether you feel comfortable doing it or not. If you can't do it, let me talk to your department head. The point at hand is if you're being cared for the VA, right? Because that's the question. And some folks have not gone outside the VA. They have basically a directive to help in this for a variety of different things. Vogue rehab forms. Again, we'll give this all to you. But I want to just show you how to scan through this and verse yourself because it's breaking down technicalities. When it comes to, you know, things like, VHA providers here being asked to add certain things, completion of DBQs to support a VA disability claim. It specifically talks about this in the directive. A no wrong door philosophy must be adopted to accommodate veterans bringing a DBQ form to a medical facility. Veterans may ask their primary care providers or specialty care providers, sleep apnea, specialty care, to complete a DBQ for conditions which are already diagnosed and documented for which the provider is treating. You provided me the CPAP. You went ahead and did this thing. You are caring for me. I'm requesting you fill out this form that is a VA form. It can be completed by the treating provider during a routine visit when there's sufficient time and the medical information is available. They can also be completed outside of an office visit or an appointment, blah, 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 and it speaks to that. Treating provider has questions regarding blah, 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 and how this is completed. They can seek further guidance from the BVA. When we talk about BVA and VHA, and I want to kind of pause on that because this is what Ronnie was asking. I want to make sure everybody understands that there's a difference between the VHA and the BVA. The VBA is the Veterans Benefit Administration. The VHA is the Veterans Health Administration. It all falls under the VA, but here's the reality. BVA is like Social Security. VHA is Medicare, Medicaid. There's a difference between the two. And I'm saying that because when we're looking at care from the VA, that doesn't correlate to disability benefits. So even in the directive, right, look at the language. Because when I say they're separate, sometimes folks don't think, oh, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But look at what it says here. If the doctor who is employed by the VHA side, because they're health administration, right? If they have issues on how to fill this out, they can reach out to the BVA. So basically that one administration reach out to the other one. So the Veterans Health Administration reach out to the Veterans Benefit Administration because there's different departments, the different sections, there are different entities within the bigger VA administration. So the Veterans Affairs rather. So just to kind of put it in context, this is a reality. So when we go back to the workshop side of the house, that's what this is. Right. So that's why we want to explain it this way, because we went through what a Nexus letter is. Now, how do I actually make a point to request it? So sometimes you have to put things to paper, because here's the thing. If I talk to my doctor and ask him something, he may or may not comply. But if that secure message goes in or that official record goes in, now how do I request that? Right. How many docs actually do for let's see, a few under impression that they don't have to.
So many doctors don't want to do this, or the two common things. I used to work at a VA outpatient clinic, and is that one, we don't have time. That's a lie. They have actually an allotted admin day in their week. That's usually the day where they don't have a lot of scheduled patients. It's mainly walk-in patients. Two, it's not an option and it's not a conflict of interest. The thing is that a lot of these people at the VA clinics and hospitals, they don't know about this directive. They don't know that it is a thing that they have to do. It's not an option. So with this template sample letter that you get, it's to help you, advocate for yourself when you're talking to your VA doctor. If they tell you, ask when you go to your appointments. And the thing with veterans, why they don't use this and why many don't know about this, is because they are afraid that if I ask my doctor to do such thing, then I'm the one stuck seeing them later, like kind of sort of like retaliation. But, that's why you have the patient advocate in place. If you are seeing such thing, talk to your patient advocate, change your doctor, request something to be changed through your patient advocate, whatever it is that you are having difficulty with. Them not having time for it again. They can schedule you an appointment specifically for that as mandated by the directive. They can do it when you go in, while you're there with them. They have your treatment records. They have treated you in the past, so they know your conditions. So they can do it then, or you can drop it off like a DBQ. You can drop it off and pick it back up. So they have to do it. The template. So what we would advise, and how we've seen it in practice, I've seen it in practice, is you talk to your doctor and you say, hey, can you fill this out for me? I've done this with my husband's claims. Can you drop this off for me? This is what it's for. I'll pick it back up on your next admin day. They either say yes or no. This sample is for you to be able to, speak for yourself, advocate for yourself, and say, this is not an option. This is your directive. In the directive, it tells you that the VMAC's director is the one to implement this. So when you send them, CC your VMAC director and send it to the director as well. There is an office in most of the VMACs, or actually all of the VMACs, which are the big hospitals, where you can go up to the office of the director and just drop it off to their secretary, or get an email address where you can send it to them. I would advise for you to send it to the director, to the nurse, upload it through your portal, because it's of record when you upload it to the secure messaging portal. That way you have record that you have given this to your nurse, you have given this to your doctor, you have sent it to the director's office, because it is their duty to assist you with any of this information. So this template is to kind of guide you through that process of how to use that directive to your advantage, because to Ronnie's point, all you see is your VA doctor. That's all you have, where sometimes you have veterans who may not have other medical insurance. You may have veterans who don't have the financial means to have other providers outside of the VA system. So this is to help you talk to your doctor. Of course, you want to not escalate the situation, verbally or, aggressively with them, where,
Yes.
obviously you feel uncomfortable, or, safe with them being a treating physician going forward. Yes, your VA doctor can do it, should do it with this directive. If they don't know what the directive is, you have access to the directive. This letter can also kind of help you craft an argument, whether it's the first time asking. That's why that verbiage in there where you see it's unfortunate that many providers feel this is optional. It's usually, this here would be used like if you ask them and they say no. If they say no, I can't do it. If they say no, it uses some of this verbiage. Take away some of this verbiage and to make it into yours. Or if it's your first time asking them, kind of reword it where it's your first time asking them to do this for you. And again, I would highly suggest and recommend that you, one, if you see them in person, give this to them in person, drop one off at the office of the director at the VA hospital, and then, upload it into your secure messaging portal. That way there's record of everything everywhere. Just cover your bases everywhere where they say, well, we didn't see it, or we didn't receive it, or we never touched it. Well, check the secure messaging portal because it's in there. But yes,
welcome to
this
the party,
directive,
Ronnie.
again, it's a directive that the VA doctor has to. I had no idea I could do this for yours. Yep.
Yeah. So I said, welcome
many
to the
people
party.
don't know that the 1134 exists.
So, but again, just to kind of, so very clearly, answer is yes to, who was it, Charles? Again, you may have asked for this before, but now again, like anything, people have filed claims, but they know how to do it correctly. So going back now, right, you're going now with this information and this directive, because again, there are instances here of not knowing what you don't know, right? So everything that Nelly said is the key point of why we're stressing this. But if you didn't know that this directive existed, you didn't know to reference it. You didn't know to go beyond the fact that this person said no. Well, I understand you don't feel comfortable, but that's not, what's happening here. There's a directive in place, your own directives. So you now have ammunition to ask for this question. Now, I want to make sure that can you send a form? Yep. So we'll give you all those things there. Again, that's why the whole thing is here, where it's like, we don't want to just give you something. We have to make you understand how this works. Now, here is a caveat to this. there is here one part where, we do, let's say, liaise with providers, organizations that do letters professionally. I'll show you what one looks like, as well on the medical side and the psychological side. Now, on the psych side of the house, there is this caveat. And this is the one part where personally I'm of the mindset where I've always leaned to kind of getting an opinion outside, because this does play a factor into it. Not saying they won't, but for requests on the mental health side, they do recommend that the veterans treating provider do not complete it. So that doesn't mean they won't do it. It just might mean that another mental health provider may have to, review the record at hand and provide the opinion, because of the relationship when it comes to mental health, because there is that relationship there. And if now you're doing this assessment for me, think about it, right? You're filling this form and you're saying that my symptoms are not meeting a disability perspective, whatever. That's going to make a very awkward conversation for the next therapy session there we're having. So this one aspect is one of the ones where they kind of put this caveat here, for mental health. So that just means that maybe the therapist that you're seeing, psychiatrist, psychologist, may not fill it out, or may have another one do it for you. However, you do have the, again, ability to have that opinion coming, let's say from another psych provider. That's some of the things that we have done. So I want to make sure we know that there. But to Brian's point, this is originally from November 2016. We're looking at an amendment of 2020. Many folks who've been in the system for a while may just not care about this stuff, may have heard about it. It came across the way. I'll get to it later. The fact is, it's not whether you like to do it or not. The policy is simple. The key here is, you don't have to know all of the 12 pages. What you need to know is the policy. And the policy is simply this: when specifically prohibited, it is the policy that they support when it comes to these things, right? So let's see that here.
For the chiropractor question, yes, I have seen a chiropractor do a letter for it, and especially DBQs. If you already are service connected for a condition and need a DBQ, your chiropractor can do it. They can also write the letters, because there are the Nexus letter, because there are your treating physician in that field of expertise that you're requiring. So you're being treated for a back condition, and the chiropractor's writing an opinion that makes sense medically, why a chiropractor would be talking about your back condition.
So I want to show what a professional one kind of looks like, of one of the providers that we work with, just to kind of show you a sample. Now, this is a very complex one, so this is not one that may be the one you pull, but this is specific for coronary artery disease, right? So we just saw a sample of how it looks. And again, this is an organization we partner with. They do this professionally, and they obviously are going to go into way much more detail than a standard one that a doctor may do, right? Because this is what they do specifically. And there's different styles to do this. So in here, right, you see the instance of we're presenting who the person is. They're presenting themselves. I've been asked to write a statement of support of, and again, this is a template that we have to kind of show you all. So that's why it's void of any personal details of the veteran, right? But just kind of going through it, this is a 5-page nexus, and it'll make sense here why. And that's why I wanted to show you the template first, because when you see the real one, you'll know what to look for versus, oh, this is ridiculous, I don't understand even where to start, right? So I'm establishing here what's being asked. I've been asked, and I'm going to say, just for this example here, right, the provider, but I've been asked to go ahead and write a statement of support of veteran, Ronnie. He's our designated veteran for the day. Disability claim. I've personally performed a thorough review, right, of the veteran's record, which includes service treatment records and personal records, VA and civilian medical records, as well as his 214 separation document. And I've also reviewed and noted the circumstances of his military service with the Army, Air Force, blah, blah, blah. I've presented, introduced myself. Veteran Ronnie, in this instance, is seeking service connection for coronary artery disease secondary to his service connected condition XYZ. Now, history, right? And again, here, obviously, there's a little more in-depth going on. Service connection condition, post-traumatic stress disorder, obstructive sleep apnea, asthma, so forth, have led to development of CAD through weight gain, obesity as an intermediary gap, and it begins the process of breaking down synopsis of basically what exactly happened to Ronnie. So in this instance here, we see now the patient history and impact to the condition. And it ends off, obviously, professionally, the limitations of the condition prevent him from being able to work a physical job, limiting career opportunities, and so forth, right? So we've now talked about, in this instance, patient history and impact. Now we go into the objective medical record, right? So his risk factors, age, gender, and so forth, but does not have a typical cardiac risk, right? So we're eliminating certain things, right? Because, hey, but Ronnie, you're predisposed to this, that, the third, right? So in this instance, right, that's the rationale being used for this. Medical literature, right? It's established and well known that CAD includes cigarette smoking, blah, blah, blah. And they begin to note references like we just pulled earlier, post-traumatic stress disorder and cardiovascular disease, and research of quality XYZ, right? An article in PTSD disorder and cardiovascular disease published 2011 says the following. So now you see that the rationale is coming to play as to, hey, I reviewed Ronnie's records. This is what he has. This is medical record history. And in turn, now here's how I'm getting to the opinion, right, that these things are connected. So obviously this is a more very, very detailed example because we wanted to be able to show what that would look like. But here you see that a study titled blah, blah, blah. A study this, that, the third, and then we get down to it, regulation, right? The VA has set of precedents for the obesity and so forth. So they start to pull in some VA stuff there. The statement, rather, at the end here, after review of the medical records, current literature, my professional opinion is that it is at least as likely as not that Ronnie CAD is aggravated by service-connected PTSD, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Keywords mean things, aggravated cause, right? Like we talked earlier. Rationale being despite non-modifiable, his service-connected conditions are known in literature to contribute. So we're eliminating certain things. The argument is made. Boom, bam, done, sign. Here's your next letter. So that's pretty much how that kind of looks like in a real-world scenario, which again is the same thing we were seeing on this side of the house, but to at least kind of put it in perspective as to how that all comes together. So does that kind of make sense? Because I wanted to make sure that at least as we're looking through it, it makes sense now being able to identify how you break that down from that perspective. So I'm going to quickly also then just kind of run through some of the other parts, but just for that purpose there, does that kind of make sense? Then I want to touch on some of the other parts of your workbook, which really begins to give you your go by, but the main gist of the Nexus letter, what are the ingredients, how to request it, and then obviously I'll touch on some points here that are also in your workbook as well.
And I just wanted to add that although you saw an example of what a letter looks like from a medical consulting company that does this for veterans, it doesn't mean that what your doctor provides or your VA doctor, your private doctor provides is going to be to that extent. Some complex conditions may be a 5, 6, 7 page Nexus letter, but not everything has to be done that way. If your condition or if your doctor can write a 1-page document that is going to include the 4 requirements of a Nexus letter, that's fine. Some doctors also like to go very in depth to cover their bases with lots and lots of journals, and it's also fine. So just keep in mind that your doctor's letter doesn't necessarily have to be that detailed as long as it meets the 4 requirements: records review, medical rationale, credentials, and medical opinion. And if it's just if your doctor believes that 2 medical journals or research does the job to connect it, that's fine. But again, sometimes more complex conditions require also, if your doctor is using more than one theory of service connection, that letter may be lengthy. By theory, I mean that if your doctor believes that you have a connection for direct service connection, they may write an opinion to that extent, but if they also believe that, for example, let's say your sleep apnea is aggravated by also your back connected condition, they may also write in there in the same letter opinion for a secondary theory. So that of course would be more lengthy because now they're explaining 2 conditions. They're explaining that your sleep apnea might have started in service due to symptomology in service, but they also believe that your service connected PTSD is aggravating your sleep apnea. So it may have 2 rationales in there, which would make it lengthier. So yeah, that's just because that sample was extremely detailed, they don't all have to do that way.
So that's the whole thing. As far as there is mandated and required to go do that now, as we just saw. So let's see, if they're obligated to create Nexus letter to us, why would you need to go to the doctor, pay someone? Well, you don't have to if they write it for you. That's the whole thing, right? So the whole point is, like we just saw, then there's a few, being kind of objective here is, okay, so I filled out this letter for you, but I just showed you also what a paid letter looks like. So the fact of the matter is, okay, I'm going to do this for you, but am I going to give you, let's say, all that's in there? So it's one of those things too, where let's just call a spade a spade. All right, this, I'm being harassed by my boss. I'm a government employee, blah, blah, blah. Here comes Ronnie. I have to do this. Great. Here's your next letter. Here's your thing. But if you think I'm going to sit here and write your 5-page letter, that's not required. Yes, I believe here's his history. So the detail and weight of it, right, is going to be also one of those things of like, I would almost rather pay this person $500 for this letter versus this person because of the fact that I already know I'm going to get there, right? So my point is, it's not so much that you have to do this, right? But if you're going to, my whole point is, we at least now understand that the VA is required. Before this class, right, or workshop rather, many folks didn't know that the VA had a directive for them to support you to do this. So that's the first point. Two, if you're going to pay someone to do this, you have to know what right looks like. If someone's going to pay, if you're going to pay someone for a letter, there are some exaggerated prices out there. I will tell you straight out that there are instances where I know veterans who have paid between $500 to $2,000 for a letter, and veterans who have paid multiple letters. And here's the thing: like, if you're going to pay that kind of money for a letter, you need to have the ability to have a conversation with whoever's doing it. And we've seen literally the responses of some of these organizations who literally would say, look, Ronnie, this is what we're doing for you. You know what I mean? Take it or leave it, because they feel they're in control to be able to help you do something. And that's one of those things where, no, you have to know what right looks like. You're able to ask questions and support this process. So as you're now going through this with a better understanding, this all kind of makes sense. So going back to our workbook, right? We establish here this concept of service connection. So when we start to look at how we're gathering, right, the evidence for this, because again, you want to be able to sometimes help your provider, right? We create this checklist to help you go through this. So things that we've explained are here for this reason. So types of evidence that you're pulling, right? We showed you the things they're reviewing. So now this is kind of like, it seems like it's working backwards, but it's more so. So now you see how it all fed into the end product is the medical records, the service records, statements from treating physicians, because you can also have instances here where you have, like I said, a statement letter, you have a nexus letter, you sometimes have multiple evidence that are going into this. So your medical records, your service records, any statements that you have for your treating physicians are things you want to start gathering, right? As you're putting all this together. Again, I'm going to file for this thing. I'm going to the process of putting it all together. I'm not just going to show up. I want to make sure that I have everything I need, because I'm going to go to my doctor, or I want even my VA doctor to factor certain things in. Not the VA may not have access to everything I have. Maybe there's some private providers I've seen. So I want to gather these things, right? So we talk, we hit on that there. And when it comes to how we access this, because that came up as well, this is here for you also as well on page 7, right? Some folks may have known that you can request records from here. I advise, if you're going to request records, hit all 3 of these, not just one, right? Hit all 3 of these to include your service as well branch. So SF 180, right? That goes to the branch of service, the ones that form that goes to the MPRC, and then VA Records Management Center as well. Hitting all 3 of those, because here's the reality: you can find different information in some of this stuff, and sadly, like we've seen, there's sometimes just gaps in certain things. Now, granted, do I have to have every single visit that I've had with my chiropractor? No. I don't, I'm not going to have everything in there, but I have my current diagnosis, the current statement of where I'm at. I may have some different visits along the way, but if I have 100 pages, the reality is maybe 5 pages is enough to be able to show proof for that provider. Because sometimes we have a lot of records for specific providers, but we want to make sure that folks that have never requested anything know where to request that information. So that information here on page 7 gives you where to request that. And if you have issues with that, again, we can support and make sure you get the needed things as needed there. But we want to make sure that you knew what that was and how to go about doing this thing. So again, hit all 3. If you've done this, if you've done it already, check. If you have not, you have that information there. Now, when we look at, the Nexus letter that you see in the sample that we've given you, right? Sometimes you may draft up a sample one to give to your provider, because they may be more inclined to do that. You may have say, hey, if I bring your sample draft go by, would you be able to look at it, right? So we kind of broke it down here as well to be able to help have the key elements there, because the sample obviously is just a go by, but you obviously want to make sure that there's a letterhead involved there, right? What is the veteran's information? Complete name, date of birth, your social. Make sure it's well organized. That's why we have the breakdown the way you saw it. Easy to follow. Use clear and concise language. keeping it simple, because again, it's going to a rater who may or may not know, their head from the butt sometimes, sadly. So we're keeping it kind of, to the point of what we want. And this is, again, if your provider wants to help you or you're drafting that sample as to how it needs to look. So again, the same things we saw, breaking it down. So you have a checklist as to how this is all being put together. Now, when you're preparing it, right, again, here are the blocks that make sense of everything we saw. Writing the introduction, again, who's writing the letter? Like you just saw both in the sample and the professional one. The nexus, medical rationale, providing relevant up-to-date medical records, personalized letters for your unique situation as needed, presenting the evidence, right? If you're citing sources or even BVA cases, right? You can look up BVA cases that actually show other veterans who have been awarded said thing. Conclusion of the letter, right? Providing the medical opinion, VA standard of proof that we talked about, at least as likely as not, right? So when we look at, you see there, the standard proof of the VA disability claim is a preponderance of the evidence. This means that the VA has determined that if it's more likely than not that the veteran's disability is due to service. So by us adding all these things, what we're doing is making it to where we're giving you the proof. You're not having to go try to find it for me, because the problem is the standard claim is fine if you think they're going to go find things for you, but that's a whole lot different than empowering a veteran to be able to actually advocate for themselves and have a fully developed claim and present all the pertinent and key things for their provider. Let me see here.
And this, I just wanted to add that this is another reason why sometimes your private physicians aren't willing to write you a letter, because they are afraid that it's possibly more of a judicial process that you're going through. They don't understand, or they kind of equate it to SSDI. But here, take note of the standard of proof at the bottom of your workbook. The standard of proof is just the likelihood of the condition. They're not making assertive decisions. Sometimes my personal doctor said, I don't want to do this because I didn't know you when you hurt your back. What does it matter if you knew me or then? The VA's standard of proof is the likelihood of something happened because of that. So it's just a medical opinion. Could it have happened that way? Yes or no, and then why? So it doesn't have to be an assertive decision. For the question, so I wanted to go back to the buddy statements as it relates to here preparing your Nexus letter. When it comes to the Nexus letter, the Nexus letter is solid medical evidence, whereas a buddy statement, it's more of a firsthand witness. So a buddy statement is never going to trump your Nexus letter, especially conditions that are heavily evaluated by medical evidence. For example, sleep apnea. Nothing that you say, nothing that your spouse says, nothing that your battle buddy says will overturn the medical evidence or trump the medical evidence needed for service connection for sleep apnea. Whereas if you're arguing, let's say, for example, a back injury, and your friend witnessed the back, they're going to take that statement, but it will still never trump a medical opinion. So buddy statements in relation to Nexus letters, they'll never trump each other. Can you write a good Nexus statement or a buddy statement? I'm sorry, a buddy statement to support your claim? Yes, but a buddy statement, like 9 times out of 10, will never be solid enough. What BA's terminology is, it's not credible medical evidence, because it's not medical evidence. So depending on what story you're trying to tell to make that connection, if you're talking about symptomology and how it affects you, yeah, a buddy statement would kind of paint that picture, but it's not going to provide any credible medical evidence to grant the service connection. The buddy statement may help to talk about the severity, but not to make the connection, if that makes sense.
It helps, but it won't make the argument. That's the biggest thing.
What would a buddy, but a buddy would help or no? Again, depending on what you're claiming, yes and no. For example, if you're claiming a mental health condition, can your spouse talk about your severity of the symptoms and how they affect in daily life? Yes, but it's going to help with more so the rating side as far as what percentage they assigned, but it's never going to define whether that condition is in fact service connected or not, which is what the Nexus does. Let's say that you take nothing away from the Nexus letter workshop, and you say, hey, I'm going to file my claim without a Nexus letter from a private provider. without a Nexus letter from a medical consulting company, and I'm not gonna either get a Nexus letter from my VA provider. I'm gonna file it with nothing. The VA is still going to ask for a Nexus opinion from their provider. So the Nexus is always going to be a requirement, whether you provide it or the VA goes out and looks for it. The Nexus is always a requirement from the collusive triangle. So a buddy statement will never trump credible medical evidence, but they help to paint the picture of how your conditions are impairing you and affecting you occupationally and socially. Yep, for the snoring, yes, your wife or a buddy can say you had snoring in service, but when it comes to sleep apnea, it will never establish the nexus because it is based on that medical study, and if a doctor is able to connect it. So you can say your buddy can say, yep, he snored every night. Yep, he snored while we were deployed.
Not a diagnosis.
You know, your wife can say, hey, we sleep in separate rooms because he snores all the time. That'll never be sufficient for them to establish the medical connection. You're always going to need that nexus, whether that nexus statement is from a private physician, a VA physician, a medical consulting company, or the VA's examiner. That nexus is always going to be needed.
So, and that's why I brought up the collusive triangle. So to Ronnie and other questions there, you submit the claim, these things have to be met. So that's what we're bridging here. Now, if we're looking specifically at that buddy letter, and again, I'll show it here in a second as far as how that supplements the conversation. But if you don't pass this check here, the buddy letters mean nothing because there's no connection to service.
Mhm.
Everybody's saying everything they've seen. It doesn't matter because we have to get the foundation first to be successful in that argument. So I'm just going to push through this real quickly. So we have this part here. Whoop, let me zoom out here. As far as preparing and having those buckets, I saw one of the questions there, which was taking the records to, let's say, your private provider. That goes into that whole fact of they have to be able to say they reviewed your records, right? So for them to say your private provider, personal physician, to write you a letter, they have to, take your VA records, take your 214, anything that they can say and review, because obviously they're going to say that they reviewed those things in the letter. So yes, taking those things is going to be key. Some of the mistakes that we talk about avoiding, and obviously you kind of have seen that as we're doing this, is overlooking relevant information. You'd be surprised how many times veterans do not factor in certain things when it comes to what they're trying to file. And especially when you start to look at symptoms and severity of things, buddy statements are great, all this is fine, but ultimately the veteran themselves has to be able to speak to their truth, not so much just expect the medical literature to do something, especially when we look at mental health. And we'll break that down too. Being too vague or general, again, you have to address the point, right? Get to the nitty gritty, not just, you guys understand or you know what it is. No, I don't understand. I don't understand how your condition affects you. Be very literal and to the point. Now, using inaccurate and unsupportive statements, sometimes I'm telling you, I have seen over the years supporting statements that have done nothing to support the statement. And I'm talking about some statements that are so completely unsupportive that if you're filing for sleep apnea, it's not a statement that says, hey, I saw this person, blah, 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 but literally the fact of mentioning cigarette smoking and things that are outside of the reason. Like this buddy letter, if anything, is proven that it's not service connected. And as ridiculous as that sounds, I've seen them. I'm like, this buddy letter is actually saying that it's not service connected. They're actually saying that the reason of your knee injury is because y'all played basketball as kids and they saw you fall 20 times. Like, how is that pertinent to the conversation? It seems so asinine, but again, it happens. Neglecting citing sources is key. We showed, for example, one of the studies there just to kind of give an example of what at times veterans can look up, which is fine. But again, if you're going to cite something, cite it correctly. If you're going to pull a BVA case, cite it correctly. This, for example, is a BVA case of a veteran who was filing for sleep apnea secondary to their PTSD. And the veteran met the requirements and was granted the claim. So the criteria for service connection for sleep apnea secondary to service-connected PTSD has been met. If you're going to cite something, cite the correct thing. Right? Cite the proper number. You'd be surprised. Sometimes folks want to start, getting fancy and pull information and go down the rabbit hole of pulling and citing things. Cite it correct, because if not, guess what? This is the citation number for this case. if you're going to reference this case to make an argument for sleep apnea, it better be 1648003, because this is the one where a veteran, excuse me, had to make a point to appeal this, and it went all the way up and obviously became a court case. And the finding was simply that the evidence, relative equipoise as to whether veteran sleep apnea is related to service, blah, 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 was indeed, correct. And they found that to be true. So if we're using things that we're referencing in our argument, reference the correct things, right? So again, it may seem very basic and kind of mundane, but I want to make sure that that is something that we touch on very quickly there. And then as we start to move into some of the other sections, and we'll open it up for questions and be able to answer all the questions that are coming up. But you've done all this stuff, right? You got your Nexus letter, the provider has done everything, however you went through it, your provider, the VA, you paid someone, whatever the case may be. What are the things that are happening after that? And again, we're putting this in here also because people need to understand the VA claim review process, right? What is exactly happening when the VA is reviewing the evidence provided? There's a misconception that because, let's say, your VA provider has filled out a DBQ or filled out a form, that you won't get called for a CMP exam. It does not replace a CMP exam. They may choose to not bring you in for one, but the fact is, this is evidence to support the argument to the rater, right, who's making a decision on your claim. So CMP exams, again, are going to take place, and then waiting for that decision, which now, sadly, with the PAC Act and what's happening right now with this whole backlog of claims and so many overflow of new PAC Act claims and all that stuff, the waiting periods have gone out the roof. For example, Jerry, his claim goes in last July, August, and literally wins his claim, a few days ago. But how long did it take to get a CMP? And then went to a CMP, and then they lost his records for the first CMP and called him in for a second CMP, right? So as far as that's concerned, like when it comes to CMP exam for sleep apnea, they'll call you in, and it could be one of those things where they're pretty much reviewing stuff. So it's like a general doctor visit. They're reviewing the records from the sleep test study that's been done. There are instances where they may call for another sleep test study as well and review that. So like for sleep apnea, they'll do something like that. For asthma, they'll have you do. They had me do, for example, a pulmonary function test, and then see a general practitioner to review and answer certain questions. So it's like a whole intake process that they do. And it's pretty much examining and verifying the sleep apnea, the symptomology, all those different things. So they're going through this whole process there. But this is, again, for you all to read at your leisure there as you're kind of going through this, but understanding that, yes, the VA receives your evidence, right? Then they're going to go through the process of reviewing said evidence. We want to make sure that all the proper things are in there, right? It could be a complex and time-consuming process. More complex claims can take longer. Like PTSD claims, think they have to verify stressors, incidents, accidents, KIAs, whatever the case may be. Some claims are pretty simple and to the point. Some claims have a multitude of different things, so that can add to the process of the waiting period too. So there's a lot of factors that go into how this all works. But as far as that whole process of what happens after is key. But then when it comes to CMP exam, and I also touch on that here when we open up, is as far as some of the tips and tactics for the CMP, because, okay, you've done all this, but then how do you present yourself? Because you want to be able to speak to your symptoms. You want to be able to not only take in this evidence as you've got, but you have to be able to fight for it, because just because you have that, that's a tool, right? The doctor is still going to sit and it's like, all right, I got it, Mr. Adams. But in your own words, talk to me. What's going on? What are you dealing with? At that point, you have to be able to speak to what you're dealing with. And the reason is, as complex as this is, you'd be surprised. You have some veterans, sadly, who just will think they can pay for a letter by someone, file the claim, do no work, and show up and just think that's going to suffice. And you show up to a CMP and it's just like, you can't even talk about what you're dealing with. I don't care what this letter says. Like, you have to be able to speak to your symptoms, because again, some folks think they can just outsource this process. Not so much going to work, right? So, we put like a checklist here as far as preparing for your CMP exam, which again, we want to hit on because you want to review your Nexus letter. Again, we went through the whole process of explaining what it was for a reason, but it may take time before the VA calls you. So let's say, for example, Jerry, goes through this process of getting this Nexus letter created, does all these different things. It takes 8 months for the VA to call you. At that 8-month mark, life has happened. You don't remember half of the stuff in the daggone letter. As the CMP time comes up, read your letters, read your document, reverse yourself in what was collected and what was put together, because it may not be something that happens the very next day. understand how the provider made the connection, because you have to be able to speak to that. Again, you're reading the next letter like the way they will. So you want to be able to be versed in that, being able to speak to the severity of your condition and how it affects your life. To Ronnie's point earlier, this is the point now where the buddy letters and all that stuff, do help to add to it, but you have to be able to speak to your symptoms. So I have my doctor who wrote this thing, who made the assessment and all that, but I have to be able to speak to my symptoms. Any buddy letters, which I'll touch on as well and clarify questions that may be there, are going to help to tell that story, because I may not tell how my, let's say, bladder problems or prostate problems affect me, but my buddy letter from my spouse that speaks about the fact that I get up every night, literally every other hour, to go urinate because of urinary frequency, that's going to add context to the conversation. The fact that I've known, let's say, Uncle Jerry, all my life, and I know that literally in the past 5 years, his symptoms have declined in so many ways. He may not want to talk about it, but I know for a fact that for him, it's hard to admit XYZ. I've seen the change. So I'm adding color to Jerry's claim as his nephew, right? As that buddy letter. Or as, let's say, Ron's friend, I can speak to the fact that, hey, I know Ron, and here there is a difference, right? There's been a disconnect in certain areas. So I'm adding color to the conversation, but my statement doesn't make the claim for him. It just adds that perspective that helps the rater see the full picture, right? And I'll kind of talk about that here as well as we move forward. But this is one key part that I want to make sure we hit on as far as speaking to that. How does it affect you? Forget everything else. What is this doing to you? The fact that you are dealing with this back condition, this knee condition, what is it limiting? Like Nelly said earlier, the social and occupational impairment. I'll pull the CFR up as well. We get to the Q&A, but we're talking about the symptoms. We want to be able to talk about how it affects us, not only work-wise, but personal. Because Tito doesn't just work, he also has a life. So the fact is it also affecting progression of work and employment and promotions? But what about regular life? You can't do certain things or activities. You're not playing with your kids doing certain things. You're not spending time doing this, that, the third. As a grandpa, you can't pick up your kids because of the way your shoulder's set up right now because of that injury you had. How does that affect you? Right? So one of the things that veterans fail when it comes to this, and again, this is literally a class that we teach that's a CMP prep. On a CMP preparation, it's how do you actually tell the story beyond the symptoms? It's not, oh, I have, because right now, for example, if I were to say, and let me kind of highlight this here so you can see it. But if I were to say, for example, my range of motion is 20 degrees with my arm. I can't go past 30 degrees. What does that mean? Like literally, what does that mean? That means nothing. You can't relate to that. On the medical records, it can talk about all those things, but how about in plain English? I can't pick up my newborn child because if my hands go past this point, my shoulder's going to give out. Or I'm a granddad and I can't pick up my grandchild. So everybody knows that, hey, I want to go again. I want to, let's say, switch it. I just had a kid. Jerry's my dad. Here's grandpa. But when I take the baby to grandpa, I am holding the baby. I'm not letting the baby go because I know that maybe Jerry's arm might give out and he drops the baby. How does that affect Jerry? Like when now I tell you that, anybody here can sympathize with the, you know what I'm saying? Like, what that feels like, or you can empathize with the fact that how does it feel having to be the parent, giving that to their, being the person on either side of that equation versus I only have 20 degrees mobility or I have instability, right? So when it comes to specifically talking about the symptoms and things that we're dealing with, it's about at times making it real. The fact that Jerry, for example, or I have 20 degrees mobility, what does that mean in English? How about the fact that I can't bring in the groceries, pick up the child, cannot do this, make it real into the context of how you're impaired. That's what's missing many a times because, okay, you have 20-degree mobility. What does that mean? I hate the fact that I have to ask literally kids to help me reach for things in a cabinet because I can't reach. And I can't climb up this ladder or what have you because I may lose balance. How do I tell that story of how those things affect me? And that's where now we're adding a whole different layer of complexity to the conversation, right? And again, we'll unpack that some more, but being able to speak to the severity of your condition and how it affects your life, it is a huge component of this. because the Nexus letter and the buddy letters are not going to be the ones that are going to be in the CMP for you. You're the one that has to tell the story. You're the one that has to tell what it feels like. The fact that, okay, I filed for erectile dysfunction, but here's the reality. I am a man who has to depend on a pill to achieve what? Like, let's just break that down. Like, how does that affect me? Not just, oh, I just have this medication. I don't like that I have to use this. That affects me in ways I can't begin to explain. Or the fact that, let's say, I don't have the ability to feel or use my hands anymore, but I was a carpenter for how many years? I can't do things. It's a problem for me to open bottles. I don't want to ask for help. I was the one asked for help. Now I got to ask for help. And the sad part is that many of us won't ask for it and we'll sit there and struggle, and it creates the scenes that we see. Right? Now, of course, here's the reality. And I've said this many times, and if you haven't heard it, you'll hear it here. But VNCC is Veterans Network Champions Club. Champions. Why? Because champions win. That doesn't mean you're not going to lose a battle. Ali got knocked out and lost some fights. But nobody says Ali's not a champion. Muhammad Ali is the best to ever do it. You know, when you look at the fact that any sports figure, what have you, Michael Jordan's a champion. Did he win every game? No. So I'm saying that to say that even in this conversation, everything we've talked about, like we talked about earlier, could be on point. That doesn't mean that there may not be an instance where you do not succeed. You may be denied, even if you have a right Nexus letter. You may be denied, even if you went in there and they're right because they just got it wrong. So when we look at now, like we talked in the beginning, what if it gets denied? What if you disagree with the medical opinion of what they've said? If you now need to add new relevant information, like we talked earlier, we're going supplemental. We're supplementing the claim to be able to give that to the VA. So we're submitting new and relevant information that's relevant. Again, what's relevant to Ron's back claim is back records. Your dental records are not needed. And I'm saying this because someone's done it. Your entire military medical file or medical file, your entire military record doesn't need to go in here. Like your awards do not belong. And I'm saying it because someone's done it. You're filing a claim for your back. Do not need your promotion board points, awards, and dental records that came with your whole C file or service or your service records. Keep it relevant to what's being submitted. It's a back claim. Keep the records in the claim relevant to that thing. Now, if we're looking at a high level review, again, if you believe that the error is in fact or law and you want your claim to be reviewed by a senior rater, it's a higher level review. But understand you cannot add to a higher level review new information. So, for example, if Jerry comes to us and he's missing certain key things, you're not going higher level review. We have to go supplemental because you're missing things. Conversely, Jerry has everything he needs and then they got it wrong, we go higher level. Now, here's the part I will tell you. There are instances, and this is the part that is frustrating, so buckle up, Ronnie, because it's frustrating. There are instances with a veteran where this is something that might ping pong back and forth. A veteran may have to go supplemental, higher level, supplemental, higher level, then win. And what I mean by that is there's a veteran who files a claim. It took him how many years to file said claim? He gets denied. He is disheartened. He feels that this is ridiculous and it shouldn't be this way. All the things we've all said. When you're done crying, and this is the part where on this side of the house, I will say that you're going to love us for the results, but you may not like us in the process. And what I mean by that is, like a personal trainer, you're not going to like when they're pushing you to the process because it hurts and I don't want to hear it right now. Okay, but you came here for a goal. So I'm saying that to say this. There are instances where a veteran gets denied and you're upset and all that happens. I'm not the one that's going to comfort you. I'm the one that's going to say, when you're done crying, let's get back to work. Now, Brian and Amy and the team, the support you, now that's fine. But sometimes you need someone to just kind of kick you a little bit. And I get it. They deny you, Jerry. I understand. It sucks. Take a knee. But guess what? We're back in the fight. Because in the moment you get winded, you got denied, you got the wind knocked out of you, and the world sucks right now. I understand. We'll talk tomorrow. Kick, cry, scream. We push back. That's the reality. We have to maintain the goal at hand. And you get up and you file a supplemental because things were missing. And then 6 months later, the VA denies you. And you're back on the floor. I get it. It sucks. Take a reset, we get back up. We go for a higher level now. Because when you came, you were missing things. So you added things, you went supplemental. 6 months later, they denied you. We know that everything was in there that needed to be in there. So now we appeal and go higher level. 6 months later, they deny you again. We go back and add more relevant new information to double down because we are right. They are wrong. We go for a supplemental. 6 months later, they deny you again. We go for another higher level after you take 3 more days of kicking, crying, screaming. At this point, by doing the math, it's been about 2 years almost, right? And on that last higher level, you win your claim. That is not a made up story. That's literally a story that has happened more times than I can count. Amy just had a veteran who had this exact same situation literally a week and change ago. The point at hand is I'm painting that picture to you because the way this works is understanding that just because you get denied, the fight's not over. 2 years pass whether or not the veteran pushed back. Whether or not you filed this claim today, a year will pass and you're still going to be underrated. So I know it's going to suck, but time is passing regardless. So if you get denied, you can do a higher level. That gets denied, you can go supplemental. That gets denied, you can go higher level. So you can bounce back and forth between these two is what I'm saying. And then towards the end, after all means have exhausted, sometimes you have to go to the Board of Veteran Appeal and have a veteran law judge review the record. And that's when you see things like what I just showed earlier sometimes where it has to go to the board and you see those case numbers. So if that's the route that has to happen, the things that we're saying are going to help even here. I make the analogy of a boxing match. We're putting in all the reps and all the things because once this, let's say, gets to a judge, it's one of those things where this gets to the judge. It's like, wait a second. So let me get this straight, Ron. You got out of Vietnam, you served, you filed a claim, you gave everything to the VA that denied you. You went for a higher level, told them what happened, they denied you. You came back, gave them supplemental. I'm seeing everything because it's gone to the judge now. So they see literally the higher level, they see the supplemental, they see the buddy statements, they see the nexus, they see the supporting evidence, they see everything. It's clear as day what's happening here, but for whatever the reason, wherever you were at, they did not get it. So fast forward, that it sits to the judge, and guess what? That hearing goes to the judge. They have the authority to make a decision that is not going to be overturned. And when you see instances like a judge that makes the determination and says, hey, guess what? Awarded, and it goes back, effective date of XYZ, it's great to see that. Wow, you got 6 years of back pay, 3 years of back pay, 2 years of back pay, 10 years of back pay. But that was 8, 10, 2 years of fighting and going through this process. The point at hand is whether it's a 1-round knockout or a 12-round knockout, there are options in place. So no matter what's going on, look, the next 6 months are going to come whether or not we've pushed back. So let's push back. As far as the probative value, like we talked about it, we define it here so you know it as well. Probative value is used to determine relevance and weight of evidence submitted in support of a veteran's claim. Now, the probative value of evidence is crucial in the VA disability claims process, and the VA has to consider all relevant and probative evidence value provided. And I'll show you that also in the CFR. When we're looking at stuff being provided to the VA, sometimes people think, oh, well, that's not something the VA has to, the VA is not going to factor it in, or they told me they're not going to look at this. Well, first of all, who told you that? Because the reality is they have to evaluate the evidence. And if you don't believe me, let's go to the CFR. If you've never seen the CFR, this is literally what governs all things in the US. The Code of Federal Regulation. This literally governs everything. Again, if you've never seen the CFR, it's what basically governs everything, like all the titles, different things. Law enforcement. I come from federal law enforcement. Title 18 gave us powers and authorities to do things in the counterterrorism world. Roads and bridges, USDA, FDA, all these things have a code. So when it comes to the disability side of the house, Code 38, Title 38, pension bonuses and veteran relief, Chapter 1, Part 4, Subpart A. So when we're looking at this here, evaluation of evidence, this is where we're coming from. So it's not just us making up words, but the element of the weight to be accorded to the character of veteran service is but one factor entering into consideration of the rating board in arriving at determination of the evaluation of a disability. Every element, AKA your service alone, is not just the deciding factor. Every element in any way affecting the probative value to be assigned to the evidence in each individual claim must be thoroughly and conscientiously studied by each member of the rating board in light of the established policies of the VA, to the end that the decision is equitable and just as contemplated by requirements of law. So when you submit things to the VA, a Nexus and that opinion and so forth, all that gets weighted. It has to be, because it's literally in the law. And this supersedes mandates and directives at the organizational level. This is literally what the federal government says has to happen. So I'm showing you that because when we're talking about, again, the probative value side of the house and that weight of evidence, that's what we're referring to. And when we talk about then the reasonable doubt is meant one which exists because the approximate balance of positive and negative evidence, which does not satisfactorily prove or disprove the claim. That's when we start to look at things like the at least as likely as not. That's when we look at things like the 50-50 side of the house, right? So the reasonable doubt starts to look at, hey, how we balance these things out. And again, all of these things here, you can look at them and we highlighted them as well for you to be able to reference that and be able to go there as well. So those are hyperlinks that will take you there. So if the question comes down to, oh, well, where does it actually say that? You click on the hyperlink, it'll take you right over to 3.102, reasonable doubt. And it'll break it down as far as how they're looking at these different things there too. So make a point if you see those online resources that we have in there to look at that, but it begins to consider here when after careful consideration, all procurable and assembled data, a reasonable doubt arises regarding service origin, degree of disability, other points such as doubt resolved, etc. And it begins to break that whole thing down. So reasonable doubt doctrine is also applicable even in the absence of official records, particularly if the basic incident allegedly arose under combat or similarly strenuous conditions, right? So again, it's that whole process of how they're putting all these things together as they're reconciling, coming together for that option or that determination. And again, we can expand it more as we kind of go start shifting to the Q&A side of the house. But I want to make sure that you all understand how those things are there. And then, of course, as we begin to shift over here, you see what the goal here is, but it's about not just presenting something to you, but to be able to give you, obviously, the resources to be able to actually sit down and read this again so it makes sense. So on this side of the house, this is what it's all about, right? When we talk about taking control of your claim, it's, again, seeking out competent, incredible providers to help obtain Nexus Letter. And now it may be your personal provider, and if they can help you, great. But if it's not, it doesn't mean that another provider who may want to give an opinion is discredited, because that's really what it comes down to. I may have not been treating George, but I am a specialist in this area. And after reviewing all his records, I can provide an opinion. Because think about it, right? You have a doctor you see, and then you move and you go to a new doctor. The new doctor looks at your old records, gets up to speed, and continues care. So for a provider who's a specialist to be able to provide an opinion, the same exact way that comes in handy. A properly written Nexus Letter can provide critical evidence for submitting a VA disability claim, as we have seen, to increase the chances of success. Don't rely solely on the examiner at the VA. Take control of your claim. That's a big one here. Some folks think the VA's calling me in for a CMP. They'll take care of me. Everything will be fine. Not so much. Don't just rely on that CMP examiner, because if they're not on your side and it's not helping your argument, that's a problem. So this is, again, when we start, we keep, and that's the reason I wanted to take a deep dive, show you not only a template, show you what a sample one actually looks like of a real one, but again, the whole point here being that this is something a veteran can add to conversation too. You don't have to be subject to just what the VA says or what they may want to push back. If they get it wrong, that doesn't mean we cannot push back. That doesn't mean we don't have the ability to, reset, reemphasize, and do things. And again, a lot of the stuff that we've hit on here can kind of go over your head sometimes. There might be a lot to comprehend, but we wanted to put it in a way that even after this, you're still going to have the ability to have a conversation with one of our advisors, to have a one-on-one conversation, because your case is unique. But the fact of the matter is, the importance of a properly Nexus letter cannot be denied, as we have established and talked about. And for most veterans, their veterans claims that they failed are due to lack of a Nexus letter or properly written one. The fact is, again, that same thing everybody sees, not service connected. Not service connected basically means there's no connection. A Nexus means connection. There's no connection to service. So how do we bridge that gap? So we're going to switch over. I'm going to kind of take off the presentation here to kind of move over to the Q&A side of the house, catch up on some of the things. We can clarify anything that needs to be clarified. But again, I want to impress on you all to definitely, again, make sure, go through the workbook, really sit down and review it, go through it all. We have literally not only the information that we have there, but even the our resources that we have for you all. I want to make sure you all have that. We have videos, information that's all available that you'll see. We do have PDFs for a variety of things. That hyperlink is here. I want to show you what that is, because we're literally going to be adding about another 30 of these things, right? So we talked about everything there, but let's say, for example, Ronnie, you're going to file a mental health claim. You want to look into the mental health things. Literally, the first one here, this PDF that we have, is a 31 mental health symptom. Click on the little bar there. It takes you to this PDF. And what's cool about this is it's not just giving you information, but it breaks down, hey, here are the symptoms they're looking at for the rating criteria. Here are personal impacts and professional impacts of, let's say, the mental health side of the house. And here is the rating criteria. So when you look at things like, for example, buddy letters, which I'll expand on here in the Q&A, it's, I know Ronnie, we grew up together. He's filing a mental health claim, and he is stating he has symptoms that fall into the 70% range. My statement is supporting him to give context to the fact that, for example, inability to establish or maintain effective relationship, the last bullet point there. I've known Ronnie for a long time, and his ability to, he recluse from us. He doesn't want to make new friends. He's away from us, blah, blah, blah. So what I'm saying is supporting and adding context, as you see, right? So again, my buddy statement, like, which again, I'll break down some more, is adding to, but you have to be able to show you have said symptoms. I want to show, again, the fact that we have all these resources here. We have, like I said, 30 more coming. So different conditions, back, knee, and all kinds of other stuff, GI disorders. So it breaks them down. They're all different. So again, browse, take a look at them. What is IBS? What are the symptoms of IBS? What is the rating criteria for IBS? What is GERD, acid reflux, so forth, et cetera, right? What are the symptoms of GERD? What is the rating criteria for GERD? Words mean things. Things like, for example, migraines. Again, and you can go down to this. There's a sleep apnea one as well in here. But what are migraines? What are the symptoms, types of migraines? What to talk with your provider about? What is the rating criteria? Because again, it means something if you understand the rating criteria. You have to be able to know that there's a difference of less frequent attacks to having very frequent attacks with prostrating and prolonged attacks that produce economic severity and so forth. So a bunch of resources here that you all can look at. And again, we have so many more coming. The sleep apnea one is actually pretty cool too, because we have this whole graphic that we put together. It kind of breaks down how sleep apnea affects other areas of the body and so forth. So that is there for you all to take a look at. Back to the workbook, we also have under that the same document that we pulled up here before, which is this directive. So the directive that we pulled up before and we showed you as far as how they're supposed to do what they're supposed to do, whether or not they like it. Well, that hyperlink will take you there. So I wanted to make sure that you also see that. So you have the sample for the 1134. And if you click on that link above it, it'll take you to the actual directive itself. So just so you all know, that will take you there, because the question is like, where's that directive you guys reference? Click on that there. It'll take you there. The resources, it'll take you there. We're adding stuff all the time to our YouTube page as well, and social media in so many different ways, fashions of form. So as how-to videos, how to do certain things, we want to definitely recommend you all check that out as well. One of the biggest things people are talking about right now is this whole proposed cuts and CBO things, et cetera. That is something that we've touched about here, veterans proposals, how to do things. So you all can take a look at the various contents that we have. We have instructional videos, how to check your disability ratings. So you can literally click on that and it actually walks you to the process of how to check for, let's say, your disability ratings on the system. So we actually recorded that for you so you can take a look at those things, how to pull your letters, how to check certain things. So a plethora of resources that are there for you all, but I wanted to make sure that I at least kind of show you how to get to those things. The Nexus Letters template that you see there, along with the 1134 template. And of course, our social media links, handles, and all that is there. There's also a hyperlink to schedule a call with one of our advisors. So we'll make sure that we have that there for you. But take a look at the workbook again, go through it, really sit down, because again, there's a lot of information in there. But as we kind of move and shift over, I want to make sure again that I impress upon you all the fact that even if you have questions that we may not address now or you don't feel comfortable, we're going to have the ability for you all to have those questions asked at a later time, individually as well. So